481. Death and Immortality. Dumbledore considered for a moment. "We cannot allow Lord Voldemort's power to keep growing," he said. He rose, studying the image projected on the wall, and frowned slightly. Even weakening him would be necessary. "But their forces are currently dispersed," Scott replied, relaying what Lambeau had told him. "The Ravens reported that the Death Eaters usually leave the castle very quickly. They have been seen elsewhere as well." Dumbledore agreed, "but they rarely remain in one place." Dumbledore nodded. "Perhaps, as Miss Slytherin suggested, Voldemort is still trying to research Harry's blood." He spoke gently. "Until he succeeds, he will remain hidden." "He was probably more affected by that failure over 10 years ago than we realize," Scott said. "After such a mistake, to avoid another one, he'll only act when he's thoroughly prepared." Dumbledore smiled. "You're right. Though Voldemort is immensely powerful, he fears death more than most." "I suppose everyone fears death," Scott said, "but he's definitely a little unhinged. Calling himself Lord Voldemort, splitting his soul into Horcruxes, and rushing to kill an infant on the basis of half a prophecy. Yes, that was a kind of madness." Dumbledore settled back on the sofa and, with an amused air, engaged Scott on the subject of death. "Death is but the next great adventure," he quoted. Scott smiled. The phrase matched his own experience perfectly, shifting between worlds and being reborn with memories. Dumbledore's eyes brightened. "Have you ever thought about immortality?" he asked. "I have," Scott answered honestly, "but if escaping death means becoming like Voldemort, I'd rather age and die naturally. At least then he'd still be human." Dumbledore explained, "Throughout the ages, true immortality for wizards has been rare. Apart from some witches and wizards whose bloodlines include other magical beings, which can lengthen life, only Horcruxes and the Philosopher's Stone grant anything like immortality." "But both cost something, right?" Scott ventured. "The stone's elixir of life keeps you alive, but it doesn't stop your body from decaying. Otherwise, Nicholas Flamel wouldn't have accepted death willingly." Dumbledore smiled again. "Very perceptive, Scott. The elixir prolongs life, yes, but it can't halt the erosion of time." Scott shrugged. He wasn't willing to drag a decrepit body through countless years. That sounded like endless suffering. He often entertained an idle wish. Why couldn't magic extend life like cultivation in the legends? But that was fantasy. He'd even researched Eastern magic traditions and found them different in method but similar in essence. No mystical cultivation that grants eternal life. So his answer was sincere. He fancied immortality but wasn't obsessed, Dumbledore noticed. "That's rare," he said admiringly, "at your age to be so open-minded about such things." "You can't say that," Scott replied with a smile. "If I could find a better way, I wouldn't mind living a few more years." They both laughed. "If life is happy and full, a few more years are welcome," Dumbledore said. "But you needn't worry about that yet." "What about you?" Scott asked. "For me," Dumbledore answered casually, "death is like finally being able to lie down and rest after a long day." Before Scott could respond, Dumbledore's attention snapped back to the projection. "There's movement," he said. Scott looked up. On the wall, the castle gate opened, and the 4 Death Eaters who had entered earlier emerged and walked away. Once they passed the range of the anti-apparition charm, they vanished with apparition. "So they really won't stay," Scott said, feeling a twinge of disappointment. "It would have been easiest to wait until Voldemort gathered all his forces and then strike, but that wasn't an option." Dumbledore withdrew his gaze from the projection and fell silent for a long moment, weighing the options. Scott knew Dumbledore wanted, above all, to see Voldemort take Harry's blood, because if Voldemort integrated Harry's blood into himself, it could create an unusually intimate connection between them. And thanks to Lily Potter's protective magic, as long as Voldemort lived, Harry could not be killed. "For the time being, we must hold our ground," Dumbledore finally said. Scott nodded. He had no objections. Trying to pick off the Death Eaters one by one was impractical. Britain was too small. By the time the Ravens reported an encounter to Lambeau, Lambeau informed Scott, Scott told Dumbledore, and Dumbledore notified the Ministry, it would already be too late. "We will investigate communities of dark creatures," Dumbledore added. "We are bound to find something." "That's all we can do," Scott agreed. After they parted, Scott walked down the spire and returned to the common room. The others crowded around him the moment he appeared. "Scott, is Dumbledore training you to be a champion?" someone asked. "You've been going to the top floor a lot lately." "If I told you, you'd probably die of shock," Scott thought, then gave them a non-committal nod. Fred pressed on eagerly. "So what's the third task like?" Scott shook his head. "I don't know. Even Dumbledore doesn't know?" Roger asked. "No," Scott replied. "I think only the wizards of the Triwizard Tournament Committee know the tasks." "So what are you training for?" Another demanded. "All sorts of things," Scott said vaguely. "Things that can make me stronger." 482. A call with Luna. "The situation is a bit complicated right now." Scott walked alone along the lake, speaking to Luna through the magic mirror. "Because the Death Eaters are scattered everywhere, Professor Dumbledore thinks Voldemort will try to incorporate Harry's blood into his body." He told her everything that had happened recently. In the mirror, Luna sat alone on the pier by the Black Lake. When Scott finished, she blinked slowly, as if only half awake, and after a long pause she nodded. "So that's how it is," she said. "Harry became the savior because his mother gave her life to protect him." She looked up. "His mother was truly brave. Does Harry know about this?" Scott shook his head. "Professor Dumbledore told me. I don't know whether he told Harry." Luna said suddenly, "Everyone has been letting their guard down lately." "What?" Scott asked. "Because you-know-who hasn't appeared in so long, and the newspapers keep praising the Ministry's victory, people think the darkness is nearly gone." "No, the dark forces are only getting stronger," Scott said. "I told people before that you-know-who hasn't been defeated, and we must not relax," Luna smiled. "But some people got angry at me for saying that." "Angry?" Scott raised an eyebrow. Luna nodded gently. "They think I'm like Professor Trelawney, always spreading panic with fabricated prophecies." She looked puzzled. "I don't understand why they'd be angry. With the minds they have, they should see I'm not lying." "Those people aren't stupid," Scott said. "They just don't want to face reality." He explained, "They'd rather cover their eyes and pretend what they fear has disappeared." "I don't understand that," Luna said. "A rational person knows evasion won't help." "Don't waste yourself trying to convince them, Luna," Scott said, half amused. "They've made a choice. Some will run away until they can't any longer." He didn't add the rest, that for some, Voldemort's existence affected their lives only marginally. If the Wizarding War flared up again, they could leave Hogwarts, even Britain. Turning a blind eye was an easy option. Many in the original story had done the same. During the Battle of Hogwarts, a fair number of students left early, even in Gryffindor. "So what are you going to do, Scott?" Luna asked suddenly. He looked at her, puzzled. "If it's confirmed that Miss Slytherin is hiding in Edinburgh Castle, what will you do?" "I'll act," he said. "At the very least, I need to disrupt her recovery and make her sleep longer." Eliminating her would be ideal, but Scott knew the odds of killing Medea were slim. Disruption was essential. He had to buy time. He would have to risk going to the Tower of Earth's core extension to retrieve the Saint Tree Heart and try to open the passage to Avalon. "It will be dangerous," Luna said with concern. "Will Professor Dumbledore help?" "I think he will." Scott, still thinking about the Tower of Earth's core extension, smiled. Luna murmured, "Do you have to go?" "The summer solstice is June 21st, and the third task of the Triwizard Tournament is June 24th. Scott was slightly surprised that Luna could read his thoughts through the mirror. "Yes, I have to go," he said. 3 days should be enough. I'll hurry back, but if I can't make it, then—" "Do the professors know?" she asked. "Of course. I've talked to Professor Dumbledore." Luna, though still worried, didn't try to stop him. "Let me think about it. I'll prepare some anti-curse items. My dad might be able to help." Scott thanked her and said goodbye. He put away the mirror and stretched. That evening, he received a message from Professor Dumbledore. "I have made a few more trips to Edinburgh Castle. Miss My, Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets should be deep within the castle's dungeon. Of course, do not act rashly, Scott. I'll talk to you tomorrow." He switched to the surveillance footage of Edinburgh Castle at once. His eyes had been in the dungeon before, but he'd seen nothing unusual. It was night now, and the dungeon deep beneath the castle was pitch black. Nothing could be seen. He checked the hall where the portraits of the Scottish kings were displayed, quiet there too. Neither members of the whole Wizarding Council nor Medea's portrait had appeared recently. He spent the night turning plans over in his head and found himself distracted in class the next day. That afternoon, he received another message and hurried to Professor Dumbledore. "Oh, Scott, have you decided what you will do?" Dumbledore asked with a chuckle. "The reason I sent that message last night was to buy you some thinking time." "It would be good if Miss Slytherin could stay asleep longer," Scott said. Dumbledore poured him a cup of unsweetened tea. "Have you chosen a realistic objective?" Scott nodded. "Even Lord Voldemort couldn't kill her. I probably can't either." Dumbledore regarded him for a moment. "Do you want to do it yourself?" "I won't take unnecessary risks, Professor." Scott smiled and pulled an ugly little lizard from his pocket. "This is Golzin. It can travel underground. Maybe it will help." Dumbledore looked at the finger-sized mini Komodo dragon wagging its tail and shook his head. "I have to warn you, Scott, the Chamber of Secrets is very hard to enter from the outside. Since Medea chose to recuperate there, it means she built it as a safe house." He slipped the still wagging lizard back into Scott's pocket and asked, "Do you have any other ideas?" Dumbledore clapped his hands. With a clear, pleasant chirp, Fawkes the Phoenix appeared in the room, singing, and flew in a graceful circle. "Oh, Professor, has it grown up again?" Scott asked, watching the proud, beautiful bird. He remembered Fawkes's rebirth at the Quidditch World Cup final last summer. "You're in luck, Scott," Dumbledore said. He rose and plucked a glowing feather from Fawkes's tail. "There are no Muggle tourists at Edinburgh Castle right now. I'll accompany you." Scott stepped forward with a smile and reached out to grasp one of Phoenix Fawkes's tail feathers. "To Edinburgh, Scotland," Dumbledore instructed. Fawkes gave a sharp cry. Scott's vision blurred, and a lightness swept through him. In a blink, he was standing on a street. His hand was empty. Fawkes had already vanished. The street was quiet. Few pedestrians passed at night, and no one seemed to notice their sudden arrival. Scott glanced up at a sign. Prince's Street. Across a park, perched on an extinct volcanic crag, was Edinburgh Castle. "How do we get in, Professor?" Scott asked. "Come with me." Dumbledore turned and strode toward the park, and Scott fell into step beside him. "If we simply walk into the castle, will Medea detect us? Can she apparate directly?" "This is Miss Slytherin's chosen refuge," Dumbledore said. "She made many preparations when she took it. So she didn't just occupy the castle to sacrifice Voldemort's Horcrux," Scott said. Dumbledore nodded. "No, but it matters little. I believe I've thoroughly investigated all of her arrangements." Scott relaxed. "Thank you, Professor." They stopped at the foot of the hill and looked up at the ancient fortress looming above. Dumbledore turned to Scott. "I will not conceal who I am this time, but you must be disguised. Medea does not yet know of the prophecy." He produced a vial of polyjuice potion and handed it to Scott. "Drink." Scott uncapped it and swallowed. The world seemed to stretch and mold around him. He felt his body contort and grow. He took out his magic mirror and checked his reflection. A stranger's face smiled back. "Is your apparition good?" Dumbledore asked, pointed to the battlements, and then vanished. Scott looked up and saw Dumbledore already standing on the wall. He aptly apparated to the battlement as well. "It seems you can take the apparition test directly," Dumbledore said. "Until you have your certificate, don't use it casually." "I understand," Scott said. For now, it was enough that he could do it. He scanned their surroundings. "Which way?" "Come," Dumbledore said, smiling, and walked as if through his own garden. Scott followed, and he extended his magical perception as far as he could. He detected something at once. The castle's magic wasn't absent, contrary to what the Ministry had reported. It was hidden. Not the sweeping, omnipresent magic of Hogwarts, but subtle and restrained. Threads of enchantment placed at strategic points, like invisible spider silk. If he hadn't been alert, he would have missed them entirely. "So you've noticed," Dumbledore said with a smile. "Then I needn't lead the way." "I won't touch the silk," Scott promised. "Good." Dumbledore explained. "Miss Slytherin has spun a web over the whole castle. The threads don't appear in daylight, and creatures without magic cannot detect them. If they are disturbed, she will sense it." As they walked, Scott realized the magic here was unusually sparse. Is there not too little magic? Setting those traps shouldn't require so little. "She exhausted much of the castle's magic when she took it," Dumbledore said. By keeping to the gaps, they moved without incident until they reached a heavy old wooden door leading down. An iron lock hung on its face. "Shall we use Alohomora? Will magic alert her?" Scott asked. Dumbledore produced a key from his pocket and opened the door. Scott stared. "So you were prepared." He pushed the door open. Beyond, a narrow downward passage was crisscrossed with dense, invisible webbing, so thick it would be impossible to pass withoutting it. "It seems we'll have to force our way through," Dumbledore said softly. "Try this, Professor." Scott crouched and let a small Komodo dragon, Golzan, slip from his sleeve, along his arm, and onto the floor. "Go, Golzan." The creature slid forward and sank beneath the ground as if into water. Good. Scott felt a little easier. If the castle had been like Hogwarts, with magic infused in each stone, this would have been far harder. Through his link with Golzan, Scott guided the creature underground and into the dungeon's interior. He drew his magic mirror and watched the feed. The corridor images were dim, narrow passages, hanging nets, single cells behind iron bars. An oppressive chill filled the place. Moonlight found only a small circle beneath a skylight as Golzan crept deeper. "Is the Chamber of Secrets here?" Scott asked. "Yes." Dumbledore looked at the mirror as well. "But there's no visible door." "A Chamber of Secrets needn't have a door," Dumbledore observed, smiling. Scott had Golzan test the wall, but as Dumbledore had implied, Medea's chamber would not yield easily. The dragon tunneled beneath the stone, but did not find a way through. "It seems your little animal could not do much," Dumbledore said with a gentle smile. He took 2 careful steps forward, drew his wand, and touched the invisible threads with a charm. Suddenly the silk turned red and visible, and the passage's filaments sprang to life, snapping and lunging with fang-like barbs and clawed tips. Dumbledore calmly raised his wand and formed a vast spherical shield charm around them. The red threads beat against it and could not penetrate. "Move," he said, and the sphere glided with them as they advanced. The strands multiplied and struck, whipping with 100 tiny lashes. Their blows were numerous rather than powerful. Dumbledore paid them no mind and kept his attention on the stone wall ahead. Scott, too, probed it with his magic. "The castle's dormant magic is waking," he said. "This wall is structured differently." "That marks the sealed chamber," Dumbledore said. "It cannot be opened by finesse. Only force will do." He stepped back and began to attack the wall. Scott bent to scoop Golzan up and hurried not to be left outside the protective sphere. As Dumbledore struck, a crimson bolt of charm, like twisting, coiling lightning, hit the stone again and again, lighting the chamber. Scott followed with his wand. "De primo!" Cracks spidered across the masonry. For a moment, Scott's mind flickered. Were they destroying an ancient monument? If the castle's Muggle custodians caught them, they could end up in trouble, but he pushed the thought aside and pressed the attack. "Stop them!" came a voice, and Medea's presence resolved behind them. The red threads swirled together and formed a translucent human silhouette above the floor. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, looking down at them. "And this unfamiliar young man. I thought we had no reason to be enemies. Tell me, why have you come to disturb me?" Dumbledore did not halt. The charms continued to flash. "I ask you to remain dormant for a little while longer," he said politely. Medea's tone tightened. "A reason," she snapped. "You would gain strength by sacrificing Lord Voldemort's soul? We will not permit such folly." "Before Voldemort is finally defeated, sleep on," Dumbledore replied evenly. "So that is it," Medea said, anger restrained. "You fear I will awaken and grow strong." "You could say that," Dumbledore admitted. She mocked him. "The greatest wizard of our age reduced to this." Dumbledore smiled faintly. "You flatter me. I am only an old man in my final days." The stone wall cracked louder and larger fragments toppled away. Heavy footsteps echoed, a metallic clanking like armor on stone. Medea dispersed her body and sent out the silks. Several suits of ancient armor, complete with halberds and blades, strode forward as if manned. Scott's eyes widened with relief when he recognized them as museum displays from the Scottish National War Museum, enchanted by Medea to move. He had seen moving armor at Hogwarts. They were formidable in numbers, but not invincible. He cast Lumos to brighten the chamber. The animated armors advanced and struck at Dumbledore's shield. At first, their blows seemed ineffectual, but then threads of red silk poured into joint gaps, winding inside the helmets and breastplates. The silk melted into a red mist, and crimson eyes flared beneath the visors. The armor shook with a sound like tearing air and then struck as one. The barrier shuddered and then split, collapsing under the combined assault. Scott stared. How had the webbing broken Dumbledore's defenses? Dumbledore had not stopped his assault on the wall. Scott reacted quickly, releasing Golzin and waving his wand. Engorgement charm. Golzin swelled and revealed the ferocious thing it truly was, a dragon-scale form that roared and sprang between them and the armors, bearing teeth and claws and blocking their advance. 484. Fight in the dungeon. The enormous Golzin lay sprawled across the corridor, completely blocking the advance of the armors. For a long beat, there was nothing but a tense silence. Red mist hung in the air, and pairs of blood-red eyes glowed unnaturally bright. With the clang of colliding steel, the unmanned armors shifted forward again, their weapons wreathed in the same crimson haze. "Golzin, hold them off," Scott ordered. "Rock armor," he added, and the command snapped through the corridor. Golzin held its ground, tail sweeping, head low, showing no fear as blades came down. Just before they struck, thick slabs of stone erupted across its skin, replacing the gray scales with a full suit of rock. Bang, bang, bang! Repeated impacts thundered off the stone shell. Debris flew in showers. "Protego!" Scott barked, and a transparent magical barrier sprang up to take the falling rubble. The armors, blows slowly chipped away at Golzin's stone plates, but the lizard kept regenerating new layers. Scott glanced back. Dumbledore was still working at the enchanted stone wall, his entire focus on the breach. He didn't even look over his shoulder. He trusted Scott enough to leave his back exposed. Scott had no time to think things through properly, but one thought was immediate. Golzin wasn't ideal for these opponents. The lizard's strength lay in vicious bites and venomous saliva, terrifying against flesh, useless against magically animated metal. Still, Scott didn't want to summon any of his other beasts. He'd drunk polyjuice. He was disguised. His quartet of element-linked summons, wind, fire, water, earth, were becoming his signature. Medea would recognize Edgar the Fire Raven and Serain the Sailfish in a heartbeat. Both were forms Scott had used openly before. He had to be careful. Bang, bang, bang. Sparks flew where metal met stone. Golzin answered with that massive tail, a rock-sheathed sweep that smashed like a flail and sent several armors stumbling back. Their hand movements were quick and unnatural, but their footwork remained clumsy. A few toppled over. "Expulso!" Scott shouted. Blue fire bloomed along one armor's helm. The helmet burst with a loud crack. The red eyes inside went out, and the empty helmet clattered to the floor. The suit of armor went motionless. Scott was already raising his wand to repeat the spell when a thread of red mist shot from the empty collar, snaked to the fallen helm, and reconnected. The eyes inside reignited. The helmet flew back up and snapped into place. The armor twitched and resumed its attack as if nothing had happened. Scott changed tactics. He flicked his wand toward the tiled floor. Glissando. It was one of Roger's favorite charms. The corridor floor became treacherously slick. The stiff-legged armors began to slide and then, with a groaning of metal, toppled into a tangled heap. He flicked his wand again and aimed at the iron grills lining the corridor. Each grill shivered and melted into linked chains that slithered out and wrapped around the fallen armors, tightening into several layers. Metal ground on metal with a harsh, screeching sound as the bindings secured their quarry. Expulso. Scott sent another blast, but it arced into the dim space behind the armors rather than at them. Protego, he snapped as blue flames slammed into his barrier, illuminating hooded figures farther down the unlit stretch of corridor. "Have Miss Slytherin's servants finally arrived?" Scott asked aloud in a voice that sounded odd to his own ears. The polyjuice had distorted him. "Wrong," a woman's voice answered. "Don't compare Miss Slytherin to that madman. We are not servants. We are partners with a common ideal." Scott shrugged aloud without smiling. "Whatever. To me, it's all the same." "You insult us," the woman snapped, anger in her tone. "Stop the chatter. Attack!" A deeper male voice bellowed, "Stop Dumbledore!" Spells of different colors streaked out at once. The members of the Wizarding Council, no subtlety of Avada Kedavra at least, launched a volley of high-level charms. Scott watched the hues ripple toward him and Dumbledore. Protego! He erected several layered shields and dropped to a knee. He quickly cast an anti-apparition charm around himself and Dumbledore, then hammered a transfiguration on the floor in front of them. One by one, the incoming spells shattered against the barriers. The ground before the prisoners shuddered, and a stone wall over a meter thick surged up, sealing the corridor and cutting off the prison cells on either side. "Golzon, go!" Scott ordered. At his command, the great lizard sank into the floor like a fish slipping under water. Scott raised his wand again, and another stone wall climbed out of the earth. Before the first wall had fully crumbled, Scott's wand tip touched the surface of the second. Runes poured from the wand and spilled across the stone, covering it in flickering circuits. The runes pulsed once and then faded, leaving the wall a different color and far more solid. He didn't stop there. Using the runic circuits, Scott wove an illusion that would take the group's sight away. Absolute darkness, a sealed path, and the surprise of Golzon's coming attack. The plan worked almost exactly as he'd hoped. Stripped of sight, the wizards panicked. Golzon struck from the shadows. Several men screamed as teeth sank home and the venom was discovered. Chaos reigned, and the intruders were forced back, stumbling blindly from the dungeon. Scott finally turned back to Dumbledore. The stone barrier they'd been hammering at, Medea's work, was far tougher than Scott's improvised defenses. Dumbledore had been casting continuously, and though the wall had spiderwebbed with cracks, it still held. "De Primo," Scott said, beginning to help. His charm drove at the wall's integrity, attempting to force weaknesses into the ancient stone. Then the thin red mist swelled back into view and coalesced into Medea's shape. The apparition floated a short distance from the damaged wall, flawless and cold. "Principal," she said, addressing Dumbledore, "stop attacking and leave this castle, or I will detonate every magical ward in this castle." At that point, the castle itself, along with any muggles inside, will be destroyed. Dumbledore turned toward her. His voice carried a weary, bitter pity. "I thought only Tom would make threats like that." At that moment, Medea's face was little more than a swirl of red mist, the red deriving from the castle's own magic. It had roughly taken on a human shape, but remained ethereal and blurred, so Scott couldn't make out any features. "Tom," the mist asked, the voice threaded with sarcasm. "Although I've always looked down on him, you're right. This is all I have left to threaten you with, Principal." Dumbledore smiled serenely. "Miss Slytherin, I see less difference between you and Tom than you might like. It is because you underestimated him that you find yourself in this trouble now." "You insult me." Medea's tone grew cold and dark. "No," Dumbledore said flatly. "I am simply stating what I see. You and Tom share much. Both of you consider yourselves superior, and both of you regard life lightly." Medea sneered. "Because I used Muggle lives to threaten you?" Dumbledore shook his head. "Not only that, you woke and readily slew 2 wizards, and you killed your husband to make a Horcrux. These accusations are meaningless, Principal." Medea's voice was like ice. "From the first time we met, you should have known our beliefs are incompatible." "I know that," Dumbledore replied, still calm, polite. "But what I want you to understand is that your threats will not sway us." "Oh." A hint of surprise in the mist. "They say Professor Dumbledore is sympathetic to Muggles. Perhaps the world has been mistaken." At that instant, a song-like cry filled the corridor. Fawkes streaked down from the skylight, his fiery wings turning the gloom to brilliance. Scott looked up and saw a familiar figure descending, gripping Fawkes's feathers. Sirius. A pleasant jolt of surprise went through him. Dumbledore had planned for this. "Good evening, Headmaster. We've escorted all the Muggles out of the castle," Sirius called as he landed. He raised an eyebrow and grinned. Of course, a few sneaky types were intercepted. Several were poisoned, claimed they'd been bitten by a monster. "Good work, Sirius." Dumbledore inclined his head. "Thank you." "Not at all." Sirius released the feathers and landed lightly. Fawkes chirped twice, drawing his glow in and perching on Dumbledore's hat. Sirius glanced first at the misted figure, then at Scott. "Oh, Miss Slytherin. And who is this?" "Good evening, Mr. Black. I am Hill." Scott used his mother Amelia's original surname. Sirius nodded to him and then looked back at Medea. "Looks like I've lost my leverage." Medea's voice was calm. "Then farewell, gentlemen." The red mist dispersed. At the same time, the stone wall behind them, barely holding, gave way in a crash. Scott stepped back, covering his mouth and nose against the dust. "She's gone," he said, muffled. Dumbledore acknowledged it. When the air cleared, they held their wands and lit the corridor. Beyond the fallen stones, a passage opened. The bricks there didn't look as old as the rest of the castle. Come, let's have a look. Sirius was eager and strode first into the opening. Scott and Dumbledore exchanged a glance and followed. They walked through 50 meters of narrow tunnel into a sunken stone chamber. Dumbledore waved his wand, and clusters of light fluttered out, brightening the room as if it were day. Now Scott could see it clearly. The chamber was roomy, its circular walls draped in deep green velvet embroidered with silver snake patterns. The floor gleamed black like polished obsidian. In the center stood a pure white stone platform, and on that platform a shattered crystal coffin lay. Lined against the walls, propped against the velvet, were white figures, ceramic, plaster-like mannequins. They were utterly white, hairless, but Scott could see that every face was identical to Medea's. Sirius had already climbed down and approached the platform. So she was sleeping in this coffin, he said, inspecting it. Stop, Sirius. Dumbledore's voice rang out sharply. Sirius halted, as did Dumbledore, who stepped down beside him. He raised the Elder Wand and let loose a warm, golden light that flowed like fire and like pure illumination. The light spread across the black floor, surging around the white platform, burning in a steady, living way. Threads snapped in the air like breaking filaments. A wisp of red smoke rose from the floor. Where it met the golden light, it blackened and then dissolved into nothing. What is that? Sirius asked, puzzled. A protective enchantment, Scott guessed, moving closer. Dumbledore nodded. If you had rushed forward, you would likely have been caught in a malicious curse, he told Sirius. What? Sirius looked startled and a shade pale. Lucky, thank you, Albus. Dumbledore smiled and corrected him. You're not a student anymore. Call me Albus. Sirius shrugged, embarrassed but amused. Professor, Scott asked, intrigued. What spell did you use? You did it non-verbally. I didn't recognize it. Dumbledore gave a modest smile. Finite incantatum, an end of all charms. Scott blinked. He knew finite incantatum, of course, but never had it seemed so absolute. He felt the same sudden understanding others must feel watching him do Transfiguration. As expected of you, Sirius breathed. Any charm is more potent in your hands. It is the advantage of time, Dumbledore said with a little laugh. The golden light dimmed and vanished. Scott concentrated, sensing the lingering magics. The curses here have been dispelled, he said. What remains are residues on the crystal coffin and the platform, damaged multi-rune circuits. He narrowed his eyes. There are traces of time magic as well. His body shifted and flowed back into its normal self. A polyjuice has worn off. He waved at Sirius, who had been surprised. Evening, Sirius. Oh, Scott! Sirius slapped him on the shoulder with a grin. Dumbledore picked you to help directly? Excellent! Scott played it down. I didn't do much. Dumbledore had already climbed the platform and crouched, studying the runed stone and the ruined coffin. Scott joined him. Professor, did we find what we were looking for? He asked. Dumbledore nodded. It appears Miss Slytherin has rested here for a very long time. She suppressed a curse and preserved her soul through the rune work on the coffin and platform and the castle's own magic. To leave, she forced herself awake and interrupted those protections. Presumably, the suppression failed, hence the curse reasserting itself. Scott felt a lift of relief. Then it follows. Only if Lord Voldemort dies will the curse he placed here vanish. Which means Medea can't act freely until then, Dumbledore agreed. We can focus on confronting Voldemort first. We should still be wary. Others in the wizarding world might attempt to interfere, Scott added, pacing around the coffin. As he did, he noticed Sirius's odd expression. Oh, Scott, you really are. Sirius gave him a thumbs up. Even I won't say the name. Scott shrugged. Harry says it. Sirius laughed with pride. Yes, Harry has always been brave. Scott nodded and hopped down from the platform to examine the plaster figures. He'd always been curious about Medea's puppets. In her fight with Voldemort at Azkaban, her true body never appeared. She attacked using remote, identical bodies, keeping herself safe. If not for her blood link to Voldemort, which made him able to curse her through that connection, she might have won. Scott hoped he might find clues to her puppet control among these figures. He moved along the wall and checked each one. Most were inert, simple forms, unfinished embryos without magic. After a dozen, he halted before a figure where he felt a faint fluctuation near the chest. He examined it carefully, pleased, and then used a cutting charm to slice away the ceramic over the heart. The plaster broke with a crisp sound, and white shards skittered to the floor. Reaching into the hollow, he pulled out a red gem. "What is it?" Sirius asked, startled. Dumbledore hurried over. "A disposable philosopher's stone." He took the gem from Scott's hand and turned it over. "So it is, different from Nicholas Flamel's. The magic within is meager. No wonder it's single use." "A philosopher's stone?" Sirius stared. "The legendary stone? Are you serious?" "A disposable version," Scott said. "Meant for a single use. After that, it's spent. And its effect won't be small, even if used once?" Sirius's excitement made him speak too quickly. Scott shook his head. "I don't know. The stone still requires method. Not everyone is Nicholas Flamel. Even with a stone, making the elixir of life or transmuting lead to gold takes skill. The disposable stones are more like batteries. I used one before to conjure a Lambo when my reserves were low. Medea used one differently. When she fought Voldemort, she used a disposable stone to alter an Avada Kedavra, giving it tracking, branching properties." Dumbledore, curiosity satisfied, handed the stone back. "Perhaps it could be more useful to you," he said, smiling. Sirius leaned in, peering at the little red gem in Scott's palm. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. "Of course," Scott said and handed it over. Scott walked once more around the wall and placed the disposable philosopher's stone into Sirius's hand. He checked the other ceramic figurines carefully and, to his disappointment, found only that single stone. He sighed. That made it impossible to tell whether Medea could create these disposable stones herself. Perhaps they had truly been left by Salazar Slytherin, or perhaps Medea had fashioned them. "Let's go. We're leaving." Dumbledore addressed Scott and Sirius. "There's no need to investigate further here. We shouldn't keep the others waiting." Fawkes, the phoenix perched on Dumbledore's hat, gave a call that sounded like assent. "Then let's go. They've been waiting." Sirius set the disposable stone back into Scott's hand and led the way. The three of them retreated down the corridor and returned to the dungeons. With a casual flick of his wand, Dumbledore restored everything to its original state. The collapsed stone wall mended, and the stone barrier Scott had transfigured vanished. They squeezed through the narrow passage and finally emerged onto the castle's ground level. "They're out!" Scott heard a familiar voice, and Remus Lupin hurried over from the other side. "Are the two of you all right? How was it in there?" "Oh, Scott." "Good evening, Professor Lupin." "Good evening," Lupin replied, surprised to see Scott. "Oh, call me Remus. I'm not your professor anymore." Lupin looked much better than before, at least better dressed. He greeted Dumbledore with respect and reported in a calm voice. "Everything's been taken care of, Professor. Shacklebolt sent people to remove the poisoned wizards to hospital, and the Muggles' memories have been modified." Dumbledore nodded. "Very well. We can go." Sirius fell into step with Lupin, the two of them walking arm in arm like teenagers. "That Miss Slytherin is gone." Sirius laughed. "Only an empty chamber of secrets remains. Hard to imagine she was sleeping in a crystal coffin." They reached the castle ramparts, where a group of familiar faces was gathered. Professor Moody, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Nymphadora Tonks, Charlie Weasley, several Aurors, and a few captured people who hadn't been poisoned. Among them stood Mrs. Zabini, her hands bound behind her back, still putting on an air of righteous indignation. "You have no right to arrest me," she protested. "I haven't broken any law in the British magical community. No one said I couldn't take a walk in this castle tonight." "Good evening, Charlie," Scott said, moving to where Charlie was standing. Charlie muttered, "Good evening, Scott. She's been talking non-stop." "She is difficult," Scott agreed. Moody's grim expression and his magical eye seemed to have lost their bite, and Shacklebolt looked as helpless as the rest. Charlie explained that Mrs. Zabini hadn't joined the battle or harmed any Muggles and refused to admit her companion's guilt. "I told you, I only came here by accident," she kept insisting. Scott's mind was elsewhere. "Charlie, are you actually going to Azkaban as a dragon keeper?" Charlie brightened. "Dragon keeper? That sounds good." "Yes, I heard Azkaban needed dragons and keepers, so I volunteered." Scott grinned. "Fred would have loved that. I don't think he'd be happy about you actually going." Charlie didn't get the joke at first, so Scott told him about Fred's complaints. Charlie laughed so loudly it almost drowned out Mrs. Zabini's objections. "A dangerous posting, Charlie," Tonks said. "You know who has broken out twice. We've lost colleagues." "I know," Charlie replied evenly. "But someone has to do it. The guards are dragons. I just tame them." "Good luck," Tonks said, then glanced at Scott and teased, "Look who it is. Hogwarts champion, our little genius Scott Trollope." She chatted with Scott about the Tri-Wizard tournament, asking him a stream of questions. Eventually, the negotiations with Mrs. Zabini broke down. Either her pleas failed, or the others simply got tired of listening. Shacklebolt had arranged transports. Some Aurors and members of the Wizengamot were being taken to the Ministry, others elsewhere. Since Scott hadn't passed his apparition test and didn't know his destination, Fawkes carried him through space again. He was taken to 12 Grimmauld Place, where he found Hagrid and the Weasleys, and overheard an Order of the Phoenix meeting. The Orders were worried. The movements of dark creatures across Britain were worrying. Fenrir Greyback's werewolf pack had been attacking wizards more aggressively and now seemed to be targeting adults rather than children. Some dark communities had migrated, others had gone to ground. All signs pointed to Lord Voldemort preparing a major move. After the meeting, Scott returned with Dumbledore to Dumbledore's room in the tower at Beauxbatons. Before they left, Scott asked, nodding toward Medea, "Professor, do you think she'll use the Merlin Order's headquarters or Hogwarts as a base next?" "Don't worry, I'll investigate thoroughly," Dumbledore promised. Back in the dormitory, Scott noticed Fred tinkering with something and guessed Fred hadn't heard Charlie's news. He decided to tell him. "What?" Fred looked up, stunned. "Charlie really went to Azkaban?" "Yes." Fred buried his head in his hands. "Why didn't anyone tell me? George, quick, lend me the magic mirror." Scott handed it over. Fred connected to George's mirror and called out, "Good evening. Is something wrong?" George appeared, clearly in a dimly lit classroom. "If nothing's wrong, talk tomorrow. I'm busy." Fred asked bluntly, "What are you doing? Night walking alone?" George stammered, awkward and guilty. Usually the smoother liar of the pair, he was terrible at it now. Fred zeroed in. "You deliberately didn't tell me Charlie was back and going to Azkaban." George's surprise was real. He fumbled, and the movement revealed the girl hiding behind him. "Alicia?" Alicia Spinnet looked up with a nervous smile. Good evening, Fred." Scott, who had been watching, recognized her. Alicia, a Gryffindor Quidditch chaser and Angelina's close friend. The scene made everything clear. "Are you two on a date?" Fred asked. "Yes," George mumbled, covering the camera with his face. "We'll talk about Charlie tomorrow. Goodbye." He winked and disconnected. "That boy," Roger said with a grin. "The Beater brothers off the market, towing the chasers. Gryffindor will be interesting." "It is," Scott laughed. "Just don't get distracted on the pitch." Later that night, Scott showered, sent William a message. "The others have been moved." William replied quickly, asking what had happened and for details. Scott connected with a video call, then sent what he knew by text. William asked whether the victim would wake. Scott replied truthfully, "Only by defeating you-know-who completely can the curse be lifted." William took it in with the calm of a future barrister. "I understand. Thank you. Stay vigilant." Scott agreed, and then fell into a deep sleep. April arrived, April Fool's Day, and the Weasley twins' birthday. Scott gave Fred and George two very talkative bludger toys that hit hard. He was satisfied with his gift choice. Whether the twins were, he could not say. May came, and activity finally stirred at Yaxley Family Castle, which Scott had been monitoring constantly. When Death Eaters began arriving through the gate on his screen, he ran straight to Dumbledore's room. "I've seen it," Scott said, watching the feed. Dumbledore nodded. "We expected it. We made some arrangements on the Isle of Man." "It looks like Voldemort's plan has been set in motion," Scott said, watching the stream of Death Eaters. "I wonder what he's going to do. Gather all his followers for something big. Another prison break?" Scott thought of Azkaban's new restraints, the special shackles that were unbreakable and immune to magic, the ones the Rosiers had helped make, the ones whose keys were held at the Ministry. But Dumbledore shook his head. "I think their target is the British Ministry of Magic," he said. Scott frowned. "Not Azkaban." "No," Dumbledore said. "The keys to those shackles are at the Ministry, and there are other things Voldemort wants there." At that moment, Scott noticed the sky above the seaside cliff darken. Dementors were arriving, countless, tattered things circling and hovering like black flags. The people in the castle began to emerge. Scott even saw Snape among them. Death Eaters, werewolves, vampires, all those who had pledged themselves to Voldemort, took their places on either side of the gate and bowed their heads. A black figure stepped out of the castle. Scott zoomed the image in his mirror. Voldemort himself strolled from the center of the parted crowd, his dark, mist-like robes whipping in the wind. He said something, but Scott's viewing device was too far away to pick up the sound. "Professor, can you hear what he's saying?" Scott asked. Dumbledore listened for a moment and shook his head. "Only fragments. No mistake, he's heading for the Ministry of Magic. The message has likely already been sent. Everyone is ready." "Professor," Scott asked, heart pounding, "may I join the fight?" Dumbledore looked at him sadly. "I'm sorry, Scott, but underage wizards are not permitted to take part in such a battle. I'll leave this to you for now, Scott." He was taken away by Fawkes before he could finish. Left alone in his room, Scott tapped his communicator and sent a message to Lambo. "Quick, send some eyes to the Ministry of Magic. A battle is about to begin." 487. 2 battles in progress. "Oh, Scott, you sound worried." On the other end of the line, Lambo still sounded a little dazed by Scott's urgency. "What happened?" "Voldemort is mustering his forces to attack the British Ministry of Magic." "Oh my God!" Lambo flapped his wings. "Now?" Scott nodded. "Dumbledore told me. Don't ask how he found out. Snape's still undercover with the Death Eaters." Lambo peppered him with questions, but Scott kept cutting him off. "Dumbledore's already gone to take part in the battle. I want to see how it develops." He switched half of the magic mirror's surface to a surveillance feed. Outside Yaxley's castle, Voldemort spoke, issuing orders. Everyone else bowed and listened. Even the most violent of his followers grew docile in his presence. Lambo complained loudly, "You know the Ministry of Magic is underground. Once the battle starts, it'll be chaos down there." "I told you, Dumbledore's in it." Scott raised his voice. "Because of the eyes you helped place on the Isle of Man, the Ministry has the advantage. They won't let Voldemort's men storm the building easily." "Are they going to fight in the streets?" "That's London. There are countless Muggles there." "They can," Scott said. "They probably set up Muggle-repelling charms around the area." "So I don't need to go into the Ministry? Good. I'm curious about the fight." Lambo immediately switched tone. "Wait, I'll fly to London now, and I'll call you when I get there." "Okay, hurry." Scott ended the call and kept watching. At Yaxley's castle, Voldemort's forces were split into 2 groups, Death Eaters on one side and werewolves and vampires on the other. Voldemort spoke again. Those assembled knelt, mouths open, in some dark incantation. Voldemort flicked his wand, and a black mist leaked from its tip. Dementors hovering in the sky absorbed the mist and began to move. Scott squinted. After inhaling the smoke, the Dementors' flight speed had increased drastically. They streaked away from the Isle of Man like black shadows, crossed the sea, and vanished from the mirror's view. The remaining figures by the castle apparated away one after another. Scott felt a tightening at his chest. He wanted to see what would happen at the Ministry. He stayed in Dumbledore's room, watching the feeds and waiting for Lambo to reach London. It would take Lambo at least an hour to fly from the Scottish Highlands to London. Scott might only catch the aftermath. But Voldemort had sent Dementors, and if they were to take part in the assault on London, they'd need time to travel. The hours stretched painfully. He checked his pocket watch repeatedly and drank more cups of tea than he realized before finally needing the bathroom. It was then that Lambo's connection came through. The mirror showed an aerial view of London. The city was a blanket of fog. Everything was a pale smear except for a small clear patch at the center, the Ministry of Magic. Lambo's voice came through, tense. "I'm above the city now. London's shrouded and the Muggles have been sent home." "Looks like the Ministry's pre-battle setup," Scott guessed. Thick fog to hide things and Muggle-repelling charms to keep people away. He was relieved the fighting hadn't started yet. "I'm going to get closer. I've got some crows setting up eyes around the Ministry. Be careful." Scott told him to pull back and leave the surveillance to the birds, but Lambo whispered back, "It's fine. I slipped in through a slightly open window." He then flew into the fog and threaded between buildings until he settled on a third-floor windowsill of a building near the ministry. "The crows are in place," he murmured. "I can't guarantee they won't be found, but I hope they work." Scott tapped the mirror, and the surveillance points around the ministry came online one by one. The cameras were placed on third and fourth floor window ledges of surrounding structures scattered around the building. "That's enough," Scott said. "Let the crows spread out. You should stay farther away." "It's okay. I'm already in the room," Lambo replied. Scott switched feeds. "Strange. Since they left earlier, the Dementors should have arrived by now." "Look," Lambo's voice cut in. Figures began to materialize out of the mist, one blurry shape after another approaching the ministry. But when Scott zoomed in, his eyes widened. The newcomers were all Death Eaters. The darker creatures, vampires, werewolves, and Dementors, had not appeared. Were they hiding in the fog, or had they been sent somewhere else? Scott's fingers trailed across the mirror as he summarized his observations and sent them to Dumbledore. At that moment, Dumbledore emerged from the ministry's main entrance, leading a group of Aurors and Order members. Scott saw him glance at the magical phone in his hand and say something to Professor Moody, who then directed the defenders. Voldemort lingered near the red telephone booth that masked the ministry entrance, then paused when Dumbledore stepped onto the front steps. "This place is well fortified, Albus," Voldemort said in a hoarse voice. "It seems our plan has been exposed." He smiled, almost serene. "Truly, Albus, I never thought you would infiltrate my ranks." His red eyes swept the Death Eaters. "Who among you is the spy?" The Death Eaters looked to the ground. "Perhaps a werewolf or a vampire," Lucius Malfoy suggested with a bow. "They're less trustworthy." "All among you are loyal, my lord," Snape added at exactly the right moment. "Dumbledore even hired a werewolf to teach defense against the dark arts at Hogwarts last year." Voldemort did not flare. "Even so, it won't change the outcome." He waved his wand. Stones from the pavement outside the ministry leapt up and rocketed toward Dumbledore and the others. The motion was a signal. Every Death Eater in the vicinity moved in at once. They smashed windows with spells and tried to force their way into the building. The Aurors and the Order fought back to hold them off. The greatest clash was at the main steps. Dumbledore and Voldemort instantly folded the fight into a white-hot duel. Torrents of force, raging flames, killing curses, and strange, unfamiliar magic spilled from their wands. Their mastery of the surrounding environment only widened the battlefield, forcing other combatants back and conceding the center of the fight to them. Wizards from both sides retreated as the two giants of the duel dominated the scene. Scott could hardly focus. A part of Voldemort's forces hadn't shown up, and he worried about what they might do. Then his comlink chimed, Professor Flitwick. "Scott, tell Albus, Hogwarts is under attack!" Flitwick's thin voice crackled. Suddenly, the pattern became clear to Scott. Voldemort had personally engaged Dumbledore to tie up the Ministry's defenders and most of the Order, while another contingent besieged Hogwarts. Their target was almost certainly still Harry. "Dumbledore is at the Ministry, Professor. There's a battle there. Dumbledore is holding off Voldemort," Scott said. "Oh," Flitwick shrieked. "The protective enchantments around Hogwarts are controlled by Albus. Minerva can only muster part of our defenses." "I'm coming," Scott said. He ended the call, put the mirror away, and activated the portkey on his wrist. He returned to Raven territory in the forest, completed his animagus transformation the instant his feet touched ground, turned into a peregrine falcon, and shot into the sky toward Hogwarts. Hogwarts came into view with Dementors circling above it. The castle was ringed by a giant silvery shield, and beyond the barrier battles raged. The most ferocious fighting was in the Forbidden Forest. Giants led ranks of trolls, centaurs, and war thestrals into battle. The thestrals were at least useful for flight, but the centaurs were struggling. Their arrows barely phased the trolls and were useless against the giants, whose massive weapons uprooted trees and shook the ground with every blow. High above, Scott resumed human form and drifted down under the safety of his cloak. He pulled a small crow from his pocket, flung it into the air, and sent a spell around it. Engorgement charm. The bird ballooned into a blazing orb of fire, Edgar, shining above the forest like a sun. "Go, Edgar. Take down those giants, then return to me," Scott ordered. He turned into a peregrine again and sped toward the castle as Edgar screamed and plunged into the fray. Over the Black Lake, Grindelows churned the water against merpeople and their tamed creatures. Giant water serpents besieged an enormous octopus, waves foamed and the surface ran red. Scott shifted into human form once more, summoned a water spirit, Siren, and used an enlarging charm. The massive sailfish descended wrapped in a shell of water and tore into a giant snake, attacking the octopus. Before he could change back, cold numbness crawled over his skin. Dementors streaked toward him at full speed. "Expecto Patronum," Scott cried. A silver peregrine burst from his wand, intercepting the chill and charging the Dementors. They recoiled. Scott seized the moment to finish transforming. He flew above the gateway to Hogsmeade and watched 2 wizards lead a force of werewolves and 2 giants in an assault on the castle gates. The leaders were unmistakable, Barty Crouch Jr. and Bellatrix Lestrange, 2 of Voldemort's most fanatical followers. 488. Entering Hogwarts, Scott, flying high, could see the whole of Hogwarts Castle was ringed by a protective enchantment. The barrier stayed intact, and the situation at the castle itself was not yet critical. But the fighting was not limited to the Forbidden Forest, the Black Lake, and the main gate. On the covered bridge across the lake, vampires were charging toward the castle. Scott realized this was Voldemort's long-planned assault. The Ministry diversion was only part of it. The attack on Hogwarts had been divided into multiple thrusts, and with Dementors filling the sky, the castle was effectively surrounded. He flew over the main gate and called out. Professor McGonagall, posted there, looked up and saw him. She covered her mouth in surprise, then waved him away. Scott would not leave. He couldn't enter the castle yet, but there was plenty he could do. After making sure McGonagall had seen him, he dropped down into the woods beside the road leading to the gate. He landed, shifted back into human form, and released Golzon. Engorgement charm, he said, and enlarged Golzon into a true Komodo dragon. Go, Golzon. Slip underground and ambush anyone trying to get to the main gate. Golzon shook its ugly, scaly head, burrowed into the earth, and vanished. Scott then summoned his last beast, the golden eagle Horus, and used a growth charm on it. Take the covered bridge and deal with the vampires. If you have to, destroy the bridge. He stroked the eagle's neck. Horus gave an almost human nod before kicking off and riding the wind toward the bridge. A giant of nearly 7 meters bearing a massive log thundered across the clearing toward Scott's position. Scott waved his wand, threw down several transfiguration effects, and apparated to the opposite side of the road. The giant never noticed. It strode on, raised its log, and roared, only to step where the ground had been altered and collapse into a deep pit. The pit was the thin illusion of ground Scott had transfigured. It couldn't support the giant's weight. As it fell, the trunks and branches of nearby trees twisted into thick, limb-like arms that pinned the giant inside the pit. Scott sent up a fire raven he'd just conjured from rock. The giant's body was below ground, only its huge head and shoulders above, and the tree arms held it fast as it bellowed and struggled. The fire raven dove into the giant's gaping mouth and spewed flames down its throat. The giant convulsed, crushed the raven in its teeth, and smoke poured from its jaws. Its frantic thrashing slowed, then stopped. It was dead. Scott relaxed the trees and let them resume their ordinary appearance. A moment later, a man stepped in beside the dead giant's head, Barty Crouch Jr. He scanned the area, searching for whoever had killed the giant. From Crouch's angle, Scott was hidden in another part of the woods. Scott narrowed his eyes and decided to let Voldemort's loyal subordinate die here. He made some noise and apparated away a short distance. 2 seconds later, Crouch reappeared where he had stood and snarled, "Whoever you are, you're dead." Scott cast an anti-apparition charm and activated a runic trap he'd left behind. Instantly, an impenetrable darkness fell, swallowing them both. Lumos! Crouch cursed reflexively, then fell silent when he realized light was useless in that blackness. That silence played into Scott's hands. In that void, he felt everything as if with his own eyes. With a few precise transfigurations, he caused long spikes to erupt from the earth around Crouch, piercing him from different angles. Metal cutting flesh, a scream, then a weakening of magical signatures until they faded entirely. Barty Crouch Jr. was dead, struck down before he had a chance to fight back. Scott did not lift the darkness. He sensed Bellatrix Lestrange approaching with a pack of werewolves. She did not rush into the void herself. Instead, she pointed and sent a werewolf to enter. The creature hesitated, then obeyed. Inside the darkness, it sniffed. "Found you," it crowed, and leaped toward Scott. Scott, floating with the cloak's aid, slipped above the werewolf's head and flicked his wand. Spikes burst up again, and the werewolf's scream echoed. Bellatrix and the others froze, momentarily stunned. Scott ordered Golzin, still underground, to ambush Lestrange. He shifted into his peregrine falcon form, slipped out the far side of the darkness, circled, and landed in a tall tree behind Bellatrix, just in time to see Golzin's attack. Behind Bellatrix, Golzin rose like a crocodile surfacing, its stony head breaking the earth. It opened its huge jaws. "Careful," a werewolf warned, but too late. Golzin clamped down on one of Bellatrix's legs. Bellatrix shrieked. "Damn it!" she cried and thrust her wand. Avada Kedavra! A green curse struck Golzin's head, but Avada Kedavra targets souls. It could not kill a transfigured construct that had no true life. Golzin endured the killing curse, released its bite as the werewolves surged forward and slipped back underground. Bellatrix lifted her hem to inspect a leg already turning greenish-blue. "It's poisoned," one werewolf said. "I know." Bellatrix snapped, then froze as the poison spread. Her knees buckled. She staggered, losing strength. Scott, perched in falcon form and ready to finish her, watched as she used her last reserves to apparat away. The remaining werewolves glanced at each other, uncertain. "What now?" one asked. "Lestrange and Crouch are both gone. Shall we leave too? Ask Greyback." They turned and fled from the woods. Scott ignored them and looked down at the vanishing darkness and the impaled corpse of Barty Crouch Jr. For a moment, he thought of a nickname the French had given Crouch, the English Impaler, and winced at how appropriate it looked. He didn't want anyone stumbling on the gruesome sight. He swooped down, reverted to human form, made the spikes dissolve, and buried Crouch's body and the blood-soaked earth deep beneath the ground. When he finished, Scott changed back into his peregrine falcon and flew up. The gate area had become disordered. Without Crouch and Lestrange giving them orders, the giants and werewolves, always prone to chaos, had fallen into disarray. A few had been bitten and poisoned by Golzin's ambush. Scott allowed himself a small satisfaction. The werewolves who had spread their curse by biting others were now tasting their own medicine. He passed the main gate again. McGonagall looked up, this time giving him a thumbs up and an encouraging gesture. Scott almost laughed at how quickly her reaction had shifted. Edgar, the stalking raven, flew over from the Forbidden Forest and called to him. Scott landed on Edgar's back in human form and cast a Patronus charm to shoo off the Dementors still circling. "Oh, Edgar, did you finish those two giants in the forest?" he asked. "Caw," came the reply. "Good. Leave the remaining trolls to the centaurs. Now go to the covered bridge and help Horace with the vampires. Your fire will suit them well." "Caw. Off you go." Scott turned into a peregrine falcon and climbed into the sky. Edgar launched toward the covered bridge at full speed. Looking over the situation, Scott decided Hogwarts itself was secure enough that he should go inside, but through a secret passage. He dove into the woods, apparated to the forest outside Hogsmeade, then transformed and flew back over the village. Hogsmeade was eerily quiet. No people in the streets, no lighted windows, no smoke from chimneys. It felt deserted. He headed for the shrieking shack and slipped in through a hole in the roof. He turned a scattering of objects into mice to sniff out the entrance to the secret tunnel. He then transfigured an old wooden cabinet into a giant wolf, climbed aboard, and rode through the passage. The wolf ran fast. 10 minutes later, they emerged beneath the roots of the humping willow. Scott sensed guards at the willow, a handful of Gryffindor students, including George Weasley. He pulled out his magic mirror and linked it to George's enchanted communicator. "Scott, your face looks familiar," George said. "I'm right under the humping willow," Scott answered. "No way, you're joking." "Not joking. Hold on, I'm coming up now." He leapt off the wolf and transformed another mouse to press the willow's knot. When the tree froze, he climbed out. "It really is you." George ran up and clapped Scott on the shoulder. "If you hadn't called, I would have thought someone polyjuiced into you." Scott grinned. "That's why I called." George laughed. "Oh, Scott, you didn't have to. I've got this." He drew out the Marauder's map. Scott nodded and turned to Lee Jordan. What's the situation inside? Is everyone okay? Not bad, Lee replied in rapid, excited tones as if doing Quidditch commentary. Their attack was discovered before it could get going, and the protective enchantments have been boosted. Once the protection's activated, they couldn't get in, George added. The professors say the castle won't be breached and told us to stay in the common room. But I worried about the secret passages, George continued, so I organized people. Students from all 4 houses, Lee said. We told them where the secret exits are and had them guard each one. 489. Everyone must not retreat. Well done. Scott gave George a thumbs up and then whistled. The giant wolf he had ridden in on sprang up from under the humping willow and padded to his side. Scott remounted and waved at George and the others. You stay here. I'm going to find Professor McGonagall. The wolf took off toward the castle gate. Professor McGonagall was still there, guarding the entrance with a neat row of knight statues in front of her. Scott's arrival on the wolf alerted them. The statues turned their heads and raised their long spears. Oh, Mr. Trollop! Professor McGonagall gave a gentle wave of her wand, and the statues returned to their vigilant positions. Professor McGonagall, Scott said, dismounting and taking out his magic mirror. I had the Raven place eyes at the Ministry of Magic. We can see how the battle there is going. He tapped the mirror twice and brought up the feeds from the Ministry. The fighting was still fierce. Voldemort and the Death Eaters were being held back outside by Dumbledore and other wizards, unable to force their way inside. The scenes were grim. Bodies lay both inside and out, fates unknown. Professor McGonagall watched the mirror a moment, brows knitted. It seems the battle here at Hogwarts will have to be fought by us alone, she said gravely. Scott looked up at the great magical barrier wrapping the castle. Professor, how much longer can our protection hold? As long as the enemy's attacks don't suddenly exceed the barrier's endurance, she replied. The castle's magic is vast. It can sustain this indefinitely if the onslaught doesn't spike. Scott noticed no comfort on her face. But the drain on it is high, isn't it? That's right. Professor McGonagall nodded. Right now, the castle's magic is not in its normal cyclical state. It's drawing down its reserves, so we can't just absorb blows forever. Scott told her about the 4 summoned beasts he had released and the effects they'd achieved. She breathed a relieved sigh. Mr. Trollop, as your professor, I ought to scold you for being reckless. Her stern expression softened into a small smile. But I also must praise you. Well done. Barty Crouch Jr. and Bellatrix Lestrange are notorious Death Eaters. This siege on Hogwarts was likely organized by them, she continued, then briefed him on the professor's deployments. Aside from McGonagall, Sprout and Hagrid guarded the Forbidden Forest. Slughorn and Sinistra were on the steps by the Black Lake Pier. Flitwick was with Professor Babbling at the covered bridge entrance. Vector, Burbage, Trelawney, and Filch patrolled the castle itself. After listening, Scott began, Professor, perhaps I should go out. A sudden, thunderous bang from the direction of the covered bridge cut him off. A storm of wind whipped up and flames roared. Scott transformed into a peregrine falcon and shot into the sky to see the covered bridge collapsing. Horace and Edgar flew above it, twin gales and lines of fire tearing the wooden structure apart. The vampires attacking from the bridge had brought strange flying creatures, draped over their shoulders like cloaks so they could soar. Voldemort bats, Scott realized after a moment. Even so, the vampires posed no threat to Horace and Edgar. The 2 summoned beasts' flight was much faster. They avoided the vampires' charms entirely. Horace used powerful winds to disrupt the bats' flight, while Edgar struck with burning lines, taking down 2 vampires in quick succession. Vampires hit by Edgar's fire flared up like dry tinder and plummeted. Scott felt eased. Despite their dark legend, vampires were no match for wizards or werewolves in direct combat. Their advantages, long life, ageless looks, and rapid healing, came with costs. They needed fresh blood and were vulnerable to fire. Outside the gate, Golzon's sneak attack seemed effective. The earth-dwelling creature slipped in and out of the ground with total stealth. Its rock armor and potent venom left the werewolves reeling. Several collapsed, poisoned. Giants, however, were harder to hurt. Scott watched Golzon bite at a giant's heel, but the wound was shallow and the venom had no real effect on such a massive body. The fight in the Black Lake had largely ended. For Saran, it was like hunting in its element. The surface floated with defeated bodies. Water snakes entangled with the giant octopus had been cut apart by watery blades. The merpeople raised their weapons and celebrated. Siren's towering dorsal fin cut through the waves as it swam. Scott couldn't see the forbidden forest, but without the troublesome giants, he was confident the centaurs and thestrals could deal with the trolls. Taking it all in, the war's shape became clear. Voldemort had marshaled dark creatures to invade Hogwarts, but the plan had largely failed. Largely because the castle's protective magic had exceeded his expectations. Scott landed and shifted back to human form, reporting the outside situation to McGonagall. "Thanks to you, Mr. Trollope," she said happily. "If you hadn't returned, we would have had to go fully defensive to keep the students safe." Scott realized anew how devastatingly effective his summoned beasts were against foes of limited power and when they had the element of surprise. He also knew their limits. Against someone like Voldemort, they would be far less decisive. Harry, Ron, and Hermione came running out of the castle then. Professor McGonagall. "Oh my goodness, it's Scott," they cried. All three were surprised to see him. "Potter, Weasley, Granger," McGonagall scolded. "You should be staying in your common room, not running about at a time like this." "We caught some of the troublemakers," Harry said loudly. "Malfoy, him and his lot." Ron was angry. Malfoy and his cronies attacked the students guarding the secret passage on the 3rd floor. Those Slytherins wanted to lead our enemies in. "Yes, Professor," Hermione added quickly. "George noticed and rushed over, and we subdued those Slytherins together. The professors still in the castle are watching them. Most of Gryffindor is guarding the secret passage, and Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw students have gone to Slytherin to prevent more mischief. We came to report." McGonagall's face went even sterner. "We'll deal with that later. For now, keep an eye on them, and do not fight with Slytherin." "Go inform Professor Slughorn," Scott said. "He's by the Black Lake Pier. By the way, the battle in the lake is over." "Professor Slughorn?" Harry looked suspicious. "He's the head of Slytherin." Ron and Hermione exchanged reluctant looks. "Professor Slughorn is absolutely trustworthy," McGonagall said firmly. "Go. He will keep watch over those Slytherins." "But," Harry hesitated. McGonagall answered, "Trust Dumbledore's judgment." Ron muttered under his breath, "Dumbledore trusted Snape once." McGonagall had no ready reply. Scott put in, more firmly, "After a semester, you should know him well enough." Hermione nodded. "All right, let's go." She pulled Harry and Ron and ran toward the pier. After they left, Scott checked the Ministry feed again. "Oh, Voldemort and his forces are retreating." On the monitor, Voldemort and the Death Eaters were falling back, fighting as they withdrew, then melting away into mist. Scott remembered Bellatrix Lestrange had already escaped. "Perhaps Voldemort knows what's going on here," he warned McGonagall. "We must be ready for him to head here directly." It was possible. Voldemort wanted Harry and might take advantage of Dumbledore being at the Ministry to strike. Scott switched the interface and sent a message to Dumbledore. In the footage, Dumbledore paused, then everyone at the Ministry and in the Order ceased fighting. They watched as Voldemort and his followers retreated into the fog and apparated away. Scott immediately went on high alert. He transformed into a falcon and circled, watching every approach. It was no surprise when Voldemort and his Death Eaters reappeared directly outside the castle gates. Scott signaled Golzin to stay below and then landed, reverting to human form. "They're here, right outside the gate," he shouted to McGonagall. A huge dark mark erupted from outside like a firework, turning half the sky green. Dementors gathered around it. The vampires from the covered bridge flew in, draped over Voldemort bats. Horace and Edgar stayed on Scott's orders. A black mist rose, and Voldemort's upper body emerged, looking down on McGonagall and Scott with contempt. He said nothing, only sneered and raised his wand. "Oh, whether our protection can withstand him," McGonagall whispered, visibly nervous. "Trollope, you must go back into the castle at once." Scott didn't move. "If I ran back now, it would be too late, Professor." He simply stared up at Voldemort. The Dark Lord's hand trembled around his wand, then a blinding red beam struck the silver barrier like lightning and sent ripples across it. The Death Eaters unleashed their charms in unison, all hammering at the barrier. Dumbledore still had not returned. Scott drew his wand and waved it at the knight statues. Engorgement charm. A statue swelled until it was a 10-meter-tall giant. McGonagall collected herself and waved her wand. The enlarged statue stretched a huge palm and pressed it against the part of the barrier where Voldemort's attack struck. Voldemort exhaled dark, red fiend fire. The fiend fire, so dangerous to control, bowed to him like a tamed serpent, turning into a giant python that lunged at the barrier. Scott continued the engorgement charm, enlarging several more statues, preparing for worst. Resisting this level of attack consumes too much magic, McGonagall said, grave. If this goes on, the commotion drew others. Soon students and professors from other posts flocked to the gate to watch Voldemort hammer the barrier. Faces were pale. No one spoke. Fall back! Professor Flitwick cried, waving at the students. All students, fall back! Some began to retreat obediently, but not everyone. No, Professor, George shouted from the crowd. This is a battle to defend Hogwarts. None of us will retreat. This is a battle to defend Hogwarts, and none of us can retreat. George's shout carried across the courtyard. Even some of the students who had been moving to flee halted. For a moment, no one spoke. All eyes turned to Professor Flitwick. Students of sufficient age may choose to stay, he said, his waving arm frozen. Professor McGonagall's voice cut through without hesitation. Younger students, return to the castle at once. At her command, the older students cheered and began shepherding the younger ones away. Scott couldn't help a small smile. Then a tremendous bang split the air. The fiendfire giant python Voldemort had conjured suddenly detonated. Red lightning, thicker than before, shot from his wand, and the ripples in the silver magic barrier around Hogwarts spread outward. With the combined assaults of other Death Eaters and dark creatures, that section of the barrier shuddered like a balloon about to burst, its silver sheen turning thin and translucent. With me! Flitwick shrieked. Fortress! He thrust his wand upward, pouring a silver light into the sky that fused with the magic barrier. Scott understood. Flitwick had cast Fortress, a charm stronger than Protego, to mend the weakened barrier. Other professors followed, their wands raised, silently sending their own silver lights into the attacked section. A few students who knew the shield charm began helping with Protego. Scott didn't join them right away. He took out the magic mirror, curious why Dumbledore hadn't returned to Hogwarts. With a phoenix's help, Dumbledore should have come back at once to take charge. On the mirror's screen, the area around the Ministry of Magic lay in a white haze. Ministry personnel and members of the Order of the Phoenix were cleaning the battlefield and repairing buildings and streets. Healers in white robes hurried back and forth, tending the wounded. Scott switched between different angles, but still couldn't find Dumbledore. He pinged Lambeau. The link connected quickly. Oh, Scott, you're back at Hogwarts? Lambeau's surprise was audible. No time to explain, Scott said. Do you know where Dumbledore went? I do, Lambeau nodded. After Voldemort and the Death Eaters retreated, your headmaster collapsed, quite exhausted. Scott wasn't surprised. Their duel had dragged on for nearly an hour. Dumbledore was old. Even at his best, he couldn't sustain a prolonged exchange of that intensity. But he didn't faint? Scott asked. The Phoenix took him away, Lambeau said. Scott didn't have time to ask more and closed the connection. If Dumbledore had been taken away to recover or to bolster the castle's own protective magic, they would need to hold the line until he returned. He slid the mirror away, drew his wand, and began to chant the shield charm. He watched the barrier's state. With everyone's efforts, it held. If they kept chipping away at Voldemort's forces, and the barrier remained supported by the castle's own magic as well as the defenders, it seemed unlikely Voldemort could break through as he had in the original account. Scott wasn't completely certain of his reasoning, but he didn't want the battle to end quickly either. If they could bleed Voldemort's forces, it would be worth it. He sent orders to his 4 summoned beasts with his mind, then transformed into a peregrine falcon. He flew up and landed on the shoulder of the giant knight statue, shifted back into human form, and watched the enemy beyond the gate. He felt Voldemort above him, looking down. Even through the barrier, the Dark Lord's gaze pressed on him, a pressure that was less a show of strength than a crazed appetite for blood, a madman's indifference to anything resembling mercy. Scott forced his breathing steady, met the gaze, and continued casting shield charms toward the attack. Voldemort's crimson eyes narrowed. He smiled, thin and bloody. If I were the old me, I would never have stuck my neck out like this, Scott thought. But he still stepped forward and returned the smile faintly, his hands moving as he repaired the barrier. In the woods to the left, Horace and Edgar hid. Cyrene was in the trees to the right. Voldemort seemed unprepared for an underage student to draw his attention and stared at Scott even more intently. Taking advantage of that focus, Scott ordered his beasts to strike. Horace launched into the sky with a sweep of broad, golden wings, wind blades condensing and raining down. White razor winds flashed through the ranks of Death Eaters, and crimson erupted where they struck. The Death Eaters who reacted in time raised shields. Giants used their bulk to block and swung huge palms to shatter the winds. As they counterattacked with wands, Horace was already high and out of reach. The assault was sudden enough that everyone outside the gate, even Voldemort, paused their assault on the barrier. At that moment, Golzin burst from the earth and sank its jaws into Fenrir Greyback's leg. The werewolf howled. Death Eaters swarmed to strike Golzin, but the creature's rocky armor deflected their blows. It only clamped down long enough to poison Greyback, then dove back underground. Golzin's venom barely touched the giants but hit the werewolves hard. Within moments, Greyback collapsed, staggered, and unstable. The Death Eaters scattered, trying to magic search the ground for the burrowing creature, but their efforts were useless. Golzin had already withdrawn under Scott's command. From the statue's shoulder, Scott watched, pleased. The flanking attacks had worked. No one was pressing the barrier now. Voldemort's displeasure flashed across his face. Then he ignored the chaos below and struck again at the barrier. Scott had half expected that stubbornness. Or perhaps the Dark Lord simply did not care for the lives of his followers, Scott thought. If that was true, another shadow streaked up from the woods. Edgar used swift flight, slipping like a black streak through the air and spewing a scorching line of fire aimed at Voldemort himself. Voldemort did not turn. He simply conjured a silver shield behind him to intercept the flame while continuing his strike at the barrier. Death Eaters below turned on Edgar. Wizards fired curses. Vampires cloaked in soulless forms swooped, and giants swung massive logs. Edgar shot upward like an arrow, adjusting its angle mid-flight so that the fire line constantly harried the silver shield behind Voldemort. While attention fixed on Edgar, a huge globe of water rose from the trees. Cyrene had revealed itself. It thrummed through the air, its sword-like jaw piercing the water to spit a thin razor water blade at Voldemort. Facing both the fire line and the water blade, Voldemort at last halted his attack on the barrier and raised another shield to block the water. Scott had anticipated that. The instant the water blade struck the new shield, Cyrene shifted angle. The blade sliced through the torsos of two giants and, turning after its trajectory, bisected the poisoned Fenrir Greyback sprawled on the ground. Voldemort countered, launching a fiendfire python toward the water ball. Cyrene withdrew into the globe and fled, but the fiendfire pursued. Scott knew the summoned beasts were uniquely resistant to most charms, even Avada Kedavra, but fiendfire was a special threat to them. They had each other. Horace dove, stirring a vortex that collided with the fiendfire. Fiendfire was volatile. Even Voldemort's expert-sculpted infernal serpent was blown apart by the storm. Voldemort's spells missed Horace. Although Cyrene's water ball was deformed and threatened, Cyrene at its center took no direct damage and, wagging its head and tail, escaped. Edgar, meanwhile, pivoted and dropped close enough for its flames to sweep through a cluster of vampires. Vampires, being highly flammable, screamed as several burst into fire and plummeted already incinerated. Edgar ceased its flames and streaked away. All four of Scott's summoned beasts pulled back intact. They hadn't slain the wizards among the Death Eaters, but they had wounded giants, vampires, and werewolves, and had emerged unhurt. The result satisfied Scott. Horace's first wind blades had stunned many wizard Death Eaters too. With those blows, Voldemort at last retreated from the barrier, condensing his form into black mist and descending to the ground. Scott turned and made a small victory gesture to the professors and students below. Before they could cheer, Dumbledore appeared, his phoenix perched on his hat, standing suddenly in front of them all. From the distance, Scott couldn't see his face clearly. "It seems your plan this time has completely failed, Tom," Dumbledore called, voice strong. Voldemort's face flared with irritation, then smoothed back to its usual malevolent calm. "Dumbledore," he answered loudly, "you'd better keep Harry Potter hidden in Hogwarts forever. Hide him behind you." "My students are not yours to worry about, Tom," Dumbledore replied. Voldemort threw back his head and laughed. "It's all right, Dumbledore. I have plenty of time. I wonder how much time you have left." "Thank you for your concern, Tom. I don't have long, perhaps, but I am only a small part of the wizarding world. I do not decide everything." Dumbledore's voice was steady. They traded barbs across the main gate. Then Voldemort's tone turned mocking. "What I hate most is your hypocrisy, Dumbledore. Look outside. This is your student's handiwork." He looked straight at Scott. "I asked, this student is called Scott Trollope, yes? A very good child, Scott." Scott narrowed his eyes as Voldemort's sneer softened into a cruel, almost admiring look. "Your bloodthirst is no less than mine," Voldemort said, laughing. "I wonder how Dumbledore will handle you now." With that final taunt, Voldemort gave Scott a long, meaningful glance, then apparated away with his followers. Even the surviving giants were taken with them. After Lord Voldemort and the Death Eaters left, the Dementors that had hovered over the castle began to drift away as well. "Have they all gone, Scott?" Professor Dumbledore asked, looking up. "Yes, Professor," Scott replied, dropping lightly from the shoulder of the giant knight statue, his cloak's levitation charm cushioning the landing. "They appear to have gone, though I can't be certain they won't try something else." His meaning was plain. He feared Voldemort might stage a surprise attack once they relaxed. Voldemort's parting words, the slur about Scott's bloody brutality, had been bait, an attempt to provoke them into opening the gates. Dumbledore understood. He nodded to Scott and turned to McGonagall. "Minerva, please see that the students return to the castle for now." "All right, Albus," McGonagall's voice carried as she began to marshal the pupils. "Everyone, now, head to the Great Hall." The other heads of house moved to help, and as they started shepherding the students away, several figures broke from the crowd and hurried over shouting. Scott watched George, Eddie, Milton, and Luna approach. "It's obvious he was only trying to provoke us," George said to Dumbledore. "He slandered Scott because Scott showed no fear, and that made him furious." Eddie added, "We don't believe what he said. Whatever Scott did, it was to protect Hogwarts." Milton, flustered and stammering, repeated, "Blue, bloody brutality. You shouldn't say that about Scott." Luna, calm as ever, took Scott's hand and looked at him. "Are you all right, Scott? Don't worry. You did what you thought was right." Scott laughed. "I'm fine, Luna." Then, to the others, "Thank you, George, Eddie, Milton. You don't need to explain anything to me. Professor Dumbledore won't think less of me because of Voldemort's words." Dumbledore smiled. "Scott is right. Believe me, I am old, but not yet senile." "Of course you're Dumbledore," George crowed. "The most powerful, smartest wizard in the world." Dumbledore chuckled and shook his head. "Do you know the biggest difference between Scott and Lord Voldemort?" "Scott has a nose," George blurted. "And hair," Eddie said. Dumbledore smiled. "Appearance aside," Luna answered gravely, "Scott does not have a demon in his heart." Milton added, "Scott loves life. He captures beautiful moments with his brush. His paintings make people smile and feel warm." "You are right, especially you, Mr. Greaves," Dumbledore nodded. "I think you understand." He turned to Scott. "I once told him that Voldemort's greatest failing is his inability to understand love. He has never known true family affection, friendship, or romantic love. His followers are servants, not friends. Scott is different. You have parents who love you, Scott, and you love them in return. You have good friends, too." He gestured at the students gathered around. "Seeing you reminds me of my own school days." "Did you have many friends at Hogwarts?" Luna asked. Dumbledore's smile faded for a moment. "This is where I fall short compared to Scott. In my youth, I was driven by ambition after family tragedy, and I did not make many friends. But I always loved my family, perhaps clumsily, and I did not lose love itself." He brightened. "So be assured, I will not misunderstand Scott because of Voldemort's words. I must speak with him privately about some matters that are not for everyone's ears." "All right, we'll head back." George called, glancing at the departing students. "Hey, Scott, I hope you're not rushing off to France on us. We have some important matters to discuss, too." "I'll go to France tomorrow," Scott answered, after looking to Dumbledore and getting a slight nod. "See you later, then," Eddie said, clapping him on the shoulder. Once the others had gone, Scott turned back to Dumbledore. "Are you all right, Professor? Lambeau told me." "I'm fine, Scott." Dumbledore waved him off. He handed Scott a magnificent feather from Fawkes the Phoenix. Scott took it, and in an instant they were in the headmaster's office. Dumbledore sank into the high chair behind his desk, looking exhausted. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Fawkes settled on a golden perch and dozed. Scott did not disturb them. Instead, he watched the desk, which now showed moving images, surveillance from beyond the castle gates. The Death Eaters had not taken any bodies with them. The scene was brutal. Fenrir Greyback cleaved by a watery blade, the giant hacked into pieces. Scott glanced a few times and then looked away. He had no taste for gory spectacle, even if he had caused it. He crossed to the sofa and sat. Above him, the portraits of former headmasters were unusually alert. "Well done, Ravenclaw boy. We saw your performance," came the voice of Phineas Black. Scott smiled politely, about to say thank you, when Black added, sourly, "For a Muggle-born, you should be proud." "Thank you," Scott said, keeping his expression even. "Though it may sound arrogant, right now at Hogwarts, there are no students from pure-blood lines more accomplished than I am." Phineas Black's painted face elongated with displeasure. "How disappointing. Purebloods are degenerating." A huge painted fist shot out from a neighboring frame and flattened him against the canvas. "Shut up, Black," growled the portrait's owner, a red-bearded, bald former headmaster, who withdrew his fist and grinned at Scott. "In Hogwarts, we are all students. No pureblood, no Muggle-born. Well done, lad. You should have been in Gryffindor. The Sorting Hat must have erred." "Enough. The Sorting Hat is never wrong." An elderly witch with long silver curls, Dilys Derwent, said sharply. "Ravenclaw values wisdom and method, but we have never lacked the courage to act." The red-bearded man countered, and the frames erupted into bickering. Their voices swelled until Dumbledore, who had been dozing, opened his eyes. "Oh, I apologize," he said, rubbing away the last of his wariness. He waved his fingers and conjured 2 steaming cups of tea, adding an extra dollop of sugar to his own. He sipped, sighed in pleasure, and the fatigue melted from his face. "I didn't expect you to come back at once," he told Scott. "I couldn't have predicted what I would do if you'd asked," Scott admitted. "When I heard from Professor Flitwick, I didn't hesitate. I activated the port key." He paused. "Though, I don't think my arrival was decisive. Even Voldemort couldn't have breached Hogwarts' defenses, the barrier held. But I couldn't stand by knowing the castle was under attack when I could do something." "Who could not love Hogwarts?" Dumbledore said, smiling. He snapped his fingers, and a house elf, wearing a tea towel like an apron, appeared and bowed so low its head nearly touched the floor. "Happy to serve, esteemed principal," it squeaked. "I'll trouble you. Please help clear the battlefield and restore everything around the school to its original state," Dumbledore requested. "Trouble?" The house elf clutched its hands and began to wail with delight. "Oh, do not be so polite. We will restore everything, every blade of grass, every tree, every broken plank." It disappeared in a flurry of tears and busy noises before Dumbledore could finish reassuring it that he had not meant such an extreme charge. "Can they really rebuild the covered bridge?" "It was completely destroyed," Scott asked. "Do not underestimate them," Dumbledore replied. "House elf magic differs from ours, but it is no less formidable." They talked through the details of the battle after Scott had returned alone. When they left the office and entered the Great Hall, the room fell silent for a moment and then erupted into cheers and applause. Most of the students had no idea of Scott's role in the defense. Their welcome was as much for the Triwizard champion as for a hero of the moment. Scott smiled, nodded, and thanked people as he made his way to the Ravenclaw table, sitting between Eddie and Milton. "Oh, our big star is back," Eddie crowed, clapping. Scott ignored the teasing and returned the gratitude of classmates until Professor McGonagall rapped her glass. "Quiet," she commanded. "Professor Dumbledore would like to say a few words." Dumbledore rose and addressed the hall. "I am very proud that when Hogwarts faced danger, So many of you stood bravely and took up your wands." "Not everyone," Eddie muttered, glancing toward the Slytherin table. "Dumbledore should expel those scoundrels." As Scott followed the look, but saw no Malfoy and his circle. Eddie whispered, "They're tied up in that small room next to the Great Hall. Filch is keeping watch." Dumbledore's voice continued, warm and steady. "Do not worry. Hogwarts will always be your strongest refuge, young witches and wizards." Scott listened, thinking of those who had tried to let Death Eaters into the school through a secret passage at the worst possible moment. That kind of betrayal, he knew, was sure to be dealt with severely. Expulsion would be the least of their concerns. Under the weight of everyone's expectations, Professor Dumbledore, unusually talkative that day, finally came to the point about Malfoy and the others. "I am very sorry," he began. "At a time when every teacher and student at this school is united against the enemy, some among us have chosen another path. Expel them." George and Lee Jordan suddenly jumped to their feet at the Gryffindor table and shouted. Like rousing a hornet's nest, their cry set the whole great hall buzzing. "Expel them!" came from everywhere. "It's a crime! Lock them up in Azkaban!" The Slytherins didn't join the shouting, but their faces had gone sour. Under the rest of the students' stares, they no longer sat up proud. Instead, they hunched and looked down. Even Professor Slughorn dipped his head and raised his cup to hide his unease. Scott saw a weary expression on Dumbledore's face as the headmaster tried to calm everyone by pressing his hands down on the podium. But it was useless. Voices rose all around, venting outrage. "They have to go." Next to Scott, Eddie's voice was loud as well. "Think about it. If those Death Eaters and dark creatures had been let into the grounds, what would have happened to us?" Hearing that, the anger around them grew louder. Bang! Bang! Professor McGonagall struck her glass, rose, and raised her wand. "Silence!" she said. The single word seemed to become a physical wave that swept the great hall. McGonagall's gaze combed the room with such severity that everyone immediately shut up. "Listen." Dumbledore pressed his hands down again. "Yes, they made a different choice." Sorrow weighed on his face. "But I do not wish to define their actions as a crime. In my eyes, they are children like you. You are not yet mature. You lack independent judgment. You are easily influenced, and you make mistakes without fully understanding them." Eddie muttered to Scott, "Is Dumbledore going to excuse those little brats? I can't accept sitting in the same school with them as if nothing happened." "Wait," Scott whispered back. "Dumbledore won't let it pass." Malfoy and his companions had already become the public focus of fury. Their parents had followed Voldemort and escaped from Azkaban. Allowing their children to remain at Hogwarts had been lenient, and many had complained before. Now, after what happened, things could not be ignored. Dumbledore's decisions would have to be strong, or he could expect a flood of howlers. "I am very sorry, and I am pained," Dumbledore said, as if reluctant. "But I have no choice." "He's finally going to say it," Eddie breathed, a little excited. Dumbledore spoke clearly. "For the 4 students who chose a different path," he announced the names, "Draco Malfoy, Gregory Goyle, Vincent Crabbe, Pansy Parkinson, are hereby expelled." "Great!" Ron from Gryffindor couldn't help himself before Dumbledore had finished. He cheered like a man who'd won a fortune. Harry, beside him, pumped his fist in the air, repeating, "Yes! Yes! Yes!" Dumbledore went on as if nothing had happened. "One more thing. From now on, all Hogsmeade weekends are cancelled. No students may leave the protective bounds of Hogwarts." "Oh no!" A chorus of groans rippled through the hall. Eddie brightened in the next beat. "Ha! Our smuggling business will do even better," he said. Dumbledore, with a faint, cold smile, destroyed the fantasy. "Furthermore, we will seal all secret passages from the school to Hogsmeade." He even gave George a small smile. "Thanks to Mr. Weasley for voluntarily showing us the entrances and exits." "No, no, no!" George howled, a distorted, painful wail. Dumbledore ignored him and announced that dinner would begin shortly. Scott patted Eddie on the shoulder as he watched the life go out of his friend's face. "You made enough this semester, right? The Triwizard Tournament merch sold well?" "It did," Eddie admitted, "but it never feels like enough." Milton leaned over. "I think Dumbledore made the right decision. It's for our safety." "I know," Eddie said. "If Death Eaters attacked students in Hogsmeade, then used Polyjuice Potion to impersonate them, They could have walked right into Hogwarts. He sighed. War really hurts the economy. We're not in the arms business, after all. After dinner, everyone gathered at the main gate. Hagrid unlocked the great doors with a jangling bunch of keys and swung them open. Moonlight and enchanted lamps lit the scene outside, a startling normality. The bodies and blood were gone, the traces of battle erased. The house elves had worked hard, even the roadside grass looked fresh. Scott stepped forward to the gate, and, at his feet, Golzin crawled up from the grass, drawing a small stir. Two huge shadows fell from the sky as Horace and Edgar glided down. A ball of water rolled over from the edge of the forest, with a Sirene swimming inside it. The sight made Hagrid's eyes go wide. Look at these little darlings. Hagrid fussed over the summoned beasts, clearly smitten. Oh, aren't you a pretty thing? He reached out his big hand to stroke Golzin's fierce head. Scott watched the expressions on the others' faces and then, with a resigned air, said, "Oh, Professor Hagrid, sorry, they're all products of Transfiguration." He flicked his wand and reduced the summoned beasts to their original sizes, then tucked them into his pocket. Hagrid's round black eyes dulled with disappointment. Scott held the tiny Golzon, no bigger than a fingertip, in his palm. "They're based on real animals, though," he said. "The Komodo dragon, the Komodo monitor, reaches up to 10 feet and lives in the Lesser Sunda Islands of Indonesia." Hagrid's face brightened at the idea. Scott added, "Of course, they're not magical beasts," but Hagrid barely cared. He was already plotting how to obtain one. Scott ignored him and moved back into the crowd. "They're coming." George stood on his toes. The crowd parted. Professor Slughorn led the 4 expelled students forward. Little Malfoy kept an arrogant tilt to his chin, but his pallid face and darting eyes showed his unease. Pansy Parkinson kept her head down and clung close to him, trying repeatedly to take his arm, each time he shrugged her off. Goyle and Crabbe lugged 2 huge trunks apiece, their faces rounded with panic. The group picked up speed as they passed through the hostile stairs, as if afraid the students around them might attack. At last they reached the main gate, and Professor Slughorn stopped. Usually amiable and jovial, he looked grave now. "To be honest," Slughorn said softly to the 4, "I feel a bit guilty. I've only been head of Slytherin for less than a year, but I am your dean. When something like this happens, I cannot deny some responsibility. But remember, this was your choice," he spoke earnestly. "I hope that in time you learn to think for yourselves and not be swayed by others. I hope you come to understand what true excellence means." His words landed like petals on stone. Malfoy's neck stayed stiff. Pansy wouldn't meet his eye. Goyle and Crabbe looked utterly bewildered. "I can see you no farther than here," Slughorn said, resigned. "Goodbye." Malfoy snorted, glanced back at the crowd one last time, and walked out. "Wait for me, Draco," Pansy whispered and reached for his sleeve, but he jerked away and strode forward. Goyle and Crabbe shouldered their trunks and followed. "Wait!" Harry darted forward out of the crowd to the gate. "You can't go, Potter!" Slughorn put out his hand to stop Harry. "Wait, Malfoy!" Malfoy swung around and glared at Harry. "What, mocking me, Scarhead?" he sneered. "I don't care. Hogwarts was never my only option. My father wanted me to go to Durmstrang." Harry stepped forward, furious. "You've never admitted your mistakes, have you, Malfoy? Since you came to Hogwarts, have you done one single good thing?" "I'm not you," Malfoy spat. "The righteous savior. Save your nauseating sense of justice. Don't lecture me." "Some people aren't worth saving." Harry clenched his fists. "Go and see if Durmstrang will have you. I bet they won't." He turned and walked back inside. Malfoy watched him go, his face twisting as if he had tasted something foul. Slughorn sighed and led them into the night. Hagrid waved the crowd away and closed the main doors. On the walk back along the Black Lake, Ron complained to Harry. "What were you trying to do back there? Why rush out?" Harry didn't really know how to answer. He's just irritating, and he's the most annoying person at Hogwarts, second only to Snape. "Can't stand losing your enemy?" George teased. "Without someone to disagree with, life wouldn't be as entertaining." "That's not it," Harry blinked, thinking. "Maybe because he was the first wizard my age I met when I came into this world. My first impression of the magical world included him. Even though I can't be friends with him, I care more than I let on." "Actually, Harry, the first person your age you met wasn't me," Ron interrupted, apparently off topic. I know what you're thinking, Harry. Scott smiled. On one hand, you don't understand Malfoy. You can't make sense of his choices, so he seems absurd. On the other, he's part of your first impressions of this world. That makes him special. Hermione chimed in, thoughtful. He's your opposite, but he was part of how you first saw the magic world. That's why you react to him. Harry made a face. That's a strange way to put it, but yeah. The mention of Cho brightened things. Hi, Cho. Harry waved like an idiot as Cho Chang passed. She waved back with a bright smile, and Harry flushed crimson. Cho turned to Scott. Scott, do your classmates at Beauxbatons know you're back? They don't, Scott said, and remembered his magic mirror. He pulled it out and called Fred. The call connected quickly. Good evening, Fred, Scott said, waving at the man in the glass. Fred's mouth dropped. Scott, you're back? Yes, you won't believe what happened today. George cut in, giddy. Fred sounded annoyed. What in the world? Tomorrow, Scott said, I'll tell you in person. I'm going to France with Professor Dumbledore in the morning. He ended the call and blocked the mirror. George smirked. Fred won't sleep tonight, he said. Scott justified himself. It's better told in person with Dumbledore there. They'll stay calmer hearing it straight. He glanced at Cho. If there's anything you want me to take to Cedric, give it to me tonight. Okay, thank you, Cho said, smiling, then ran off with other girls. Harry watched her go and Scott patted his shoulder. Stop staring. What? Harry stammered, flustered. You should find a new target, Scott whispered, teasing. After all, with Cedric around, unlike in the original story, Cho wouldn't be likely to pick Harry over a tall, handsome boy like Cedric. I don't know what you mean, Harry said, forcing a smile. Scott squeezed his shoulder and left it at that. George laughed. Poor Harry. Youth. Harry yelped and hurried off. Hermione looked thoughtful as Ron peered after him, puzzled. What's he like? Ron asked. None of your business, Ron, George said with a grin. He pulled Scott aside to ask about the events of the day. Scott didn't hold back. Eddie, Milton, and Luna joined them along the lake as Scott told the whole story. The battle, the siege on the Ministry, and more. Only then did some of them realize how intense the Ministry's attack had been. So, it was all planned? George said slowly. Do you think you know whose target was Harry? Scott nodded. Apparently. He tried to take Harry at the Quidditch World Cup final as well. Dumbledore had said Voldemort wanted something from the Ministry too. Scott suspected it was the prophecy orbs in the Hall of Prophecies, the same sort of prophecy that had led to Harry's parents' deaths. A prophecy is recorded by a prophecy orb, and only the person the prophecy concerns can pick it up and interpret it. Scott, who had his own prophecy worries, wished he could destroy the orb that recorded his fate. What exactly does he want? Luna asked in her drifting voice. You mean you know who? Eddie supplied. Luna said the name simply. Eddie shrugged. Isn't it obvious? He wants to rule the wizarding world. Luna shook her head. I don't think that's truly his aim. Huh? Eddie looked puzzled. Scott explained. Maybe he wanted that when he was young, to win over pureblood families, promote pureblood supremacy, and gather followers. But he's a half-blood himself. Purebloods can't be completely relied upon. Later, he turned on them and ruled by fear. I think what he really wants now is survival, eternal life, power, he's magic beyond imagining, and to eliminate anyone who threatens him. If he did conquer the world, I don't think he'd care what happens to it afterward. Maybe you're right, George said. Luna amended gently. He's not simply mad. He's self-centered and doesn't understand love. That's what Dumbledore meant when he said he doesn't understand love, Scott added. That's his weakness, Eddie said. But who embodies the magic of love? I've never heard of such a thing. How could we use it against him? Maybe Dumbledore is inventing a magic that represents love, George said dreamily. Once he comes up with it and teaches us, we can defeat you-know-who. The thought seemed to bolster him. For once, he said Voldemort's name aloud, without flinching. That night, Scott and the others lingered outside the castle for a long time. After not seeing one another for a while, they had plenty to talk about. They moved from Lord Voldemort to the Triwizard Tournament, to Scott's studies and life in France, and to the recent goings-on at Hogwarts. Partway through, Roger tried to link up with Scott's enchanted mirror. George grinned and said, Fred couldn't get through to you, so he rang Roger instead. Scott wanted to hang up and block him on the spot, but he was worried something might actually be wrong, so he answered. Sure enough, Fred's face filled the glass, huddled close to Roger. "Damn it!" Fred shouted. "What on earth happened?" "All right, they're fine," Scott said, and cut the call, then blocked Roger's mirror. The conversation resumed, and they kept chatting until Filch found them with a magical lamp. Only then did they finally go back into the castle. Back in the common room, Scott found Cho waiting. She pressed a letter into his hand. "Scott, can you give this to Cedric?" "I'll be your messenger," he said, taking the letter and shaking it lightly. "Cedric will be thrilled. You've definitely got him wrapped around your finger, Cho." He teased. "That boy didn't even have a dance partner for the Yule Ball." "Oh," Cho's friends covered their faces and burst into giggles. Cho laughed too. "I only found out later. Before the Yule Ball, he asked me, and I didn't stop him from finding someone." "You hit the jackpot, Cho," Marietta Edgecombe said with a nudge. "Cedric's a model student and a model boyfriend. What's your secret?" The other girls crowded around, envious. "I don't have any secrets," Cho said, smiling. Eddie elbowed Scott. "You two pulled that off? I didn't expect Cedric to be so sly." Scott laughed. "I'm not lying for him. It's true." "You're joking." Eddie's eyes went wide. "That was the Yule Ball." Scott shrugged. "I only danced the opening dance too. The rest of the night I sat with Cedric. 2 idiots." "No, you're different, Scott," Eddie said, trying to grin. "Your partner was Fleur Delacour, the Beauxbatons champion, the most beautiful girl there. That's enough to make anyone jealous." "Thanks." Scott managed a practiced smile and glanced toward the stairs to the girls' dormitory. Luna was coming down holding a tiny, elegant castle. "This is the house I made for Seleno," she announced. She set the little castle on the table. It was delicate and beautifully crafted, and Scott felt a pang of self-consciousness about how bluntly he'd stuffed his summoned beast into his pocket. Luna bent down and called softly, "Seleno, look who's here." A tiny figure pushed open the castle's tiny door and stepped out onto the balcony. "Squeak, Scott!" Seleno chirped, flapping translucent wings until she landed in Scott's open palm. "You've grown," Scott said, smiling. "How are you, Seleno?" "I'm very well," Seleno said, gesturing enthusiastically, then fluttered back to Luna. "I like Luna's house very much." Luna beamed. Scott chatted with both of them for a while, then inspected Seleno's miniature home, suddenly feeling like a big kid playing with a dollhouse. Milton and Seleno exchanged greetings. Milton had even written a few songs for the creature. Eddie, predictably, stared at the tiny castle as if it were a pile of galleons, whispering to Scott about selling more toys like it. He received the long, cold look from Milton that always shut him up. Before they left, Luna pulled Scott aside and looked at him quietly for a long moment. Her eyes had that strange faraway look they sometimes got, as if her magical sight had glimpsed something no one else could. "You will have an adventure, Scott," she said in a dreamy whisper. Scott thought of his plan to retrieve the Saint Tree Heart from the Tower of Earth's core extension before the summer solstice. "Wait," Luna suddenly darted up the stairs. Eddie craned his neck. "Did you finally confess to her?" "Shut up," Scott muttered, but Eddie kept peeking. Moments later, Luna hurried back down and pressed a small white animal skull into Scott's hand. "Take this." Scott turned the skull over. Animal skulls weren't uncommon, but this one was unnervingly smooth and gave off the faintest, strange white glow. Oddest of all, 2 bright red rosary peas had been set into the eye sockets. "My dad bought it from a Peruvian wizard," Luna explained. "It's a tiny alpaca skull with rosary peas inlaid. The Peruvian said it can resist curses." Scott held it and felt a whisper of magic from it. Whether the skull could actually repel curses was another matter. "Thank you," he said. It was Luna's thoughtfulness that mattered. The same as when she'd given him the Soro Meng siphon, the Lumos accelerator, and the dirigible plums before. Their usefulness was uncertain, but the gifts had come from a good place. "This will help keep your adventure from getting into trouble," Luna said with a nod. "You will get what you want." "I hope so." Scott smiled back. "Good night." Luna scooped up Seleno's castle and dashed back upstairs. "Let's go," Scott told Eddie and Milton, and the 3 of them returned to the Ravenclaw dormitory. Eddie, curious about the skull, leaned over as Scott put it on the table. "Luna says it wards off curses?" Eddie made a face. "I think it is the curse." Milton peered closer. The shape is odd, but I don't sense any bad aura. Scott set the skull aside, then pulled 4 summoned beasts from his bag and placed them on the table. All right, he spoke softly to them. I've decided to make a home for you, even if it can't be as pretty as Seleno's. The creatures chirped excitedly. Scott produced a small wooden box from his deformable lizard skin bag, the same box Lucio had used to carry the 4 materials when he gave them to Scott. It had 4 compartments already. Perfect, Scott murmured. 4 rooms and a familiar scent. Before he finished, the little creatures swarmed the box. Edgar and Horace even flew up and squeezed into their compartments. Scott watched, speechless. How cute, Milton said. Now it looks like a toy chest. Not yet. Scott set the box down and pushed the creatures out one by one. He drew his wand and began to weave the undetectable extension charm. Scott, Milton lowered his voice like a conspirator. Using the undetectable extension charm without permission is illegal. I know, Scott said, but sometimes you have to bend a few rules for convenience. He thought of all the little illegalities he'd already committed. Somehow they never seemed to weigh him down. Eddie rolled his eyes. There are Death Eaters using unforgivable curses, and the Ministry still hasn't fixed everything. Good point, Scott said, and with a steady hand he tucked thin strips of parchment into the newly enlarged compartments, then transfigured the paper into miniature landscapes. Siraine's room became an underwater coral reef. Golzan's, a windswept slice of the Gobi. Edgar's, a field of black volcanic rock. Horace's, a dense mountain forest. The spaces had been extended by the undetectable extension charm, so there was plenty of room inside. Scott gently placed each creature into its own compartment. They immediately began to explore. Siraine filled his room with water and swam. Golzan burrowed into the sand. Edgar and Horace took to the air. He then fashioned several tiny enchanted lamps and set them into the lid before closing it. Will they be able to breathe? Milton asked, worried. Scott shrugged. Don't worry. The box isn't hermetically sealed, and they're not ordinary animals. Eddie eyed the finished box with a schemer's gleam. If the Ministry hadn't regulated the undetectable extension charm, this would be a gold mine. Scott rolled his eyes. I'm going to take a shower. He grabbed a change of clothes and left his toiletries on the bedside table. After a hot shower and a flop onto his familiar bed, Scott sighed in contentment. I think I'll sleep well, he said, and drifted off. He dreamed of the skull, whether because of the skull itself or his own anxieties, he couldn't tell. In the dream, the darkness was absolute, like his worst visions, and the skull became the only light. It wasn't bone, but transparent crystal, glowing a pure, warm white. The eye sockets held luminous red crystals. The image stubbornly lingered when he woke. He caught sight of the skull on his bookshelf, sat up, and slid it into his deformable lizard skin bag. Then he found another bag, this one uncharmed, and tucked the wooden box with the summoned beasts inside it. He hung both bags side by side on his belt, finished dressing, and slipped out while Milton and Eddie still slept. He went straight to Professor Dumbledore's office. Let's go, Dumbledore said, waiting. We'll have breakfast with Beauxbatons. Fawkes, faithful as ever, carried the two across the distance to France. They appeared in the main hall on the first floor of the tower. At that hour, the hall was nearly empty. They must have slept late last night, Scott said, smiling, and took a seat at the long table. Dumbledore sat at the head, smiling, and the house elves brought breakfast. As Scott ate, people began to trickle down from the upper floor. Oh, Scott! Professor Dumbledore! The room filled, and the questions came in a rush. I heard you went back to Hogwarts yesterday. What happened? Did you take him back? You should be punished. Fred and Roger glared at Scott. Scott just noticed the dark circles under their eyes and grinned. He pulled Cho's letter from his pocket and handed it to Cedric. Cedric's face lit up when he saw it. Dumbledore put down his knife and fork. Everyone, please sit, he said gently. The crowd settled, expectant. Let's have breakfast first, then I will explain. Dumbledore chuckled. No, Fred protested at once. We want to know what happened yesterday. Dumbledore only chuckled more. After breakfast, I promise. Scott swore he had never seen such a tryingly difficult breakfast. 494. Preparation before starting the adventure. Except for Scott and Dumbledore, nearly everyone devoured their breakfast in a hurry, barely tasting the food. When one person set down a fork, the rest followed. All eyes were fixed on Dumbledore. The long table felt heavy with expectation, as if everyone already suspected what the headmaster would say. Dumbledore, however, would not let silence fester. In a calm voice, he announced what had happened the day before. Yesterday, Lord Voldemort led his Death Eaters to attack the British Ministry of Magic, and he ordered creatures of the dark to besiege Hogwarts. Fear flitted across most faces, even though they had half expected such news. Before anyone could react, Dumbledore went on. He failed. We learned of his plan before it was executed. At both the Ministry and Hogwarts, his attacks came to nothing. In the end, he had no choice but to withdraw. A collective, shaky sigh passed around the table. Dumbledore rose without waiting for questions. That is all I have to say, he added with a small smile. I'm going to pay Madame Maxime a visit. He walked out of the hall. Left behind, Scott found himself the target of a sudden onslaught of questions. Scott! Fred barreled over and looped an arm around Scott's shoulders. Tell us, what happened? Why did Professor Dumbledore bring you when this was going on? Why didn't he tell the rest of us? Roger demanded. Cedric, without even finishing the letter Cho had given him, blurted, Is the Ministry all right? Is Hogwarts safe? Most importantly, was anyone lost? His worry for Mr. Diggory, who worked at the Ministry, showed in his voice. Fred's hold around Scott tightened. Any news about my dad? Or Percy? Questions came in a rush from all directions. All right. Scott wriggled free from Fred's grip. I can't breathe. He rubbed his throat and forced everyone to calm down. Hogwarts wasn't breached. As for the Ministry, yes, several Aurors were killed. At those words, the room fell quiet for a moment. Scott hurried to reassure them. Don't worry too much. Dumbledore didn't mention any of your family members, so they're all safe. See? Cedric brightened. If Dumbledore didn't say anything, my dad must have come through it. I wasn't that worried, Fred said stoutly. My dad's tough, even if he has to deal with Percy. Roger elbowed him. Based on his dueling club record, Percy's probably stronger than you. That's only because I wasn't trying, Fred protested. If I'd fought properly, he'd lose all dignity as head boy and run to Mum in tears. Nobody paid much attention to Fred's boasting. Percy's personality might grate, but his competence was obvious, and most considered him more reliable than the prank-loving twins. Scott then gave a brief, careful account of what had happened. He left out the most sensitive details. He didn't mention that he had remotely monitored Voldemort and the Ministry battlefield, nor did he reveal the special portkey he had used. Despite his recent standing on the field of battle, Scott was cautious. The more who knew how he'd gathered intelligence, the greater the risk of exposure. He only said that Dumbledore had been in his rooms when the news arrived and that a phoenix had brought him back to take part in the defense. That tidbit especially irritated Fred and Roger. You should have called us, Fred snapped. Hogwarts was under siege. We missed it. You said you'd run away if there was a war at Hogwarts, Scott teased Roger. Now you regret it. Roger, who had indeed once joked about fleeing, now sounded defensive. I knew Hogwarts wouldn't be breached. The castle's defensive magic would hold them outside. That's why I said it. Shut up, Roger Davies. Caccini shot him a withering look. Saying that only makes you look worse. Roger subsided. Scott gave a concise description of the battle at Hogwarts, Voldemort's appearance, the way everyone had combined shield charms to repair the barrier, and even the involvement of the 4 expelled students. When he finished, he and Dumbledore had just arrived at Hogwarts early that morning, but his classmates pressed him for more, particularly about Lord Voldemort himself. Terrified as they were also obsessed with every detail, his voice, his magic, his clothes. Most had seen the Dark Lord at the Quidditch World Cup final, but all wanted a closer look. On a whim, Scott transfigured a stack of plates into a large, startlingly lifelike model of Lord Voldemort. The sudden apparition sent several classmates back from the table. They clustered several steps away, eyes wide. Scott reached out and tapped the bald head. Here, he said. This is what he looks like. Take a good look. Fred leaned in first. He really does have no nose, he observed. A little emboldened by the fact it was only a model, others chimed in. His skin and eyes don't look human. He isn't wearing shoes. His robes look like they're made of black mist. So he's almost naked under a magical robe? Ah, gross. For a moment, the students forgot classes and exams. Scott found the exercise oddly useful. Mockery seemed to blunt a little of their fear. For a split second, he even imagined a prank from his previous life. A man dressed as Voldemort in women's clothes dancing in a ridiculous routine. The idea of circulating such a clip through the wizarding world made his lips twitch, but he dismissed it. Voldemort's curses were real and dangerous. Provoking him would be reckless. After lunch, the group went to Beauxbaton's castle. Word of the events in Britain had already reached France. A copy of the morning's Furstenberg Daily reporting on the skirmishes had been circulating. The article was sparse on detail, but confirmed that fighting had occurred at both the Ministry and Hogwarts. Scott and his companions attracted attention everywhere they went. Even the Durmstrang delegation watched them with curiosity. "Oh, we should have waited a few more days to come to class," Roger muttered, uncomfortable with the attention. "You should be proud," Fred said. "This is the situation in Britain." Cedric argued soberly. "We can't stand by and watch. The last war over 10 years ago didn't only affect Britain." "But it was mainly Britain," Fred countered. "You know whose power isn't the same as Grindelwald's used to be." Scott nodded. Grindelwald had a vision of changing the world. Voldemort only cares about himself. It was a difference of scale. Grindelwald's ideology, wizards ruling over muggles, had some logic behind it. Voldemort's aims were narrower, viciously personal. Scott admitted he found parts of Grindelwald's rhetoric oddly tempting in theory, but both were extremes, and he had no desire to see such ideas succeed. In the days that followed, Lord Voldemort went quiet again. Yaxley Castle on the Isle of Man, which Scott had kept an eye on, also fell silent. Dumbledore drew a conclusion. "Voldemort must have realized he had been anticipated," he said. "He expected a surprise attack and found instead that we were prepared. Either we monitored his movements, or one of his subordinates is an undercover agent. He is proud and confident in his magic," Dumbledore added. "He is a master of legilimency. He would not easily believe a subordinate could deceive him. If he wanted to hide, he would choose somewhere more secluded." Scott asked, "Do we really have an undercover in the Death Eaters?" "Medea planted one before. Did Madame Roll cooperate?" Dumbledore shook his head. "For the safety of the person involved, I will not say a name." Scott didn't press. Instead, he offered, "If you can give me the addresses of known Death Eater families, the pureblood residences, I can monitor them. I might be able to find traces of Voldemort." Dumbledore smiled faintly. "Most of those family homes are well hidden. Their locations are revealed only to those they trust." Scott protested. "The Ministry has investigated them before. Mr. Weasley found some of them. Lucius Malfoy threw away the diary, you remember." Dumbledore did know some addresses, and after a moment wrote a short list and handed it to Scott. Scott immediately put out his net through Lambeau and began to scan. Dumbledore remained cautious. "Voldemort knows this, too. If he really intends to disappear for a while, he won't hide in the homes of families being watched." Scott accepted that, but he had no other options. While helping Dumbledore gather more intelligence, he was also preparing for his own mission. He did not hide that from Dumbledore. He had to reach Melanesian Island before sunrise on the Summerstice, June 21st. With the Tri-Wizard tournament final scheduled for June 24th, he would need Dumbledore's help. Scott had no intention of entering the so-called tower that extends to the Earth's core himself. The legend spoke of terrible, unseen curses, and he had no way of resisting them. His plan was to send his summoned beast down and control it remotely from outside the tower. That required Dumbledore's blessing. For the operation to stand a chance, Scott had been busy modifying the summoned beast's equipment. He did not tamper with the beasts themselves. They were balanced creatures, and changing their core magics could make them unstable. Instead, Scott planned to outfit them with specialized gear that would support remote control, signal relay, and resistance to dimensional interference, in case the tower sat in some alternate space like Avalon. For that, he enlisted Dumbledore's help and the Ravenclaw mentors' cooperation. They would not rewrite the beasts. They would equip them. 495. Strange Librarian. Busy times always passed quickly. By the time Scott had done everything he could to prepare, it was already June. It was Tuesday, June 20th. After his morning classes, he climbed alone to the top of the tower to see Dumbledore after lunch. Dumbledore took one look at him and already guessed his purpose. "Oh, Scott, you're leaving now?" he said. "Yes, Professor." Scott replied, "I'm going to check the local library. Maybe I can find more information." He unrolled a scrap of parchment, his translation from the animal hide, and let Dumbledore read. "The land of silence, the tower extending to the earth's core. 7 set out, 1 returns. 1 dies in fire, 1 dies in deep water, 1 dies at the treetop, 1 dies at the bottom of the tower, 1 dies from falling rocks, 1 dies from a ground collapse, 6 die from the curse, and the one who luckily escaped will forever be unable to escape the shadow of death. The island of the northernmost archipelago, the longest day of white, the place where the shadow of the standing stones points." Scott tapped the paper. "Although Britain's Midsummer Night is on June 23rd, that's a Muggle festival. The actual longest day is June 21st. Dumbledore glanced at the lines, then looked back at Scott. "Have you considered whether 7 people might be a literal condition?" Scott frowned. "You mean the tower requires 7 people to enter?" "It's only a hypothesis," Dumbledore said, "but it's not impossible." Scott hadn't thought of that. If the tower truly demanded 7 people to enter, he wouldn't recruit 6 others to risk their lives. He couldn't do that. He made a decision fast. "In that case, forget it." He shook his head. "I won't drag 6 people into danger with me." Dumbledore smiled gently. "About prophecies, whether you act on them or sit and wait, those are just different responses. We have no standard for which is superior." He paused. "Voldemort was a man who actively answered a prophecy. We all know how that ended." Scott let out a short laugh. Dumbledore's point calmed him. If the prophecy demanded 7, that might spare others. But a different possibility had just occurred to him. What if he himself was meant to retrieve the Saint Tree heart, pass through the passage, and awaken Salazar Slytherin? That kind of dark fate wasn't impossible. Then he remembered something Luna had told him. During the last summer, she'd said the Oak Sea was not the end, and that he would get what he wanted. Luna's strange certainty made him trust this path a little more. He decided to go to the northern island anyway. Too much hesitation stalled everything. At his request, Dumbledore had Fawkes the Phoenix deliver them to the island north of Scotland. "This is my adventure, Professor," Scott told him, hoping Dumbledore would stay behind. "Oh no," Dumbledore said with a small laugh. "You're still my student, Scott. I am your headmaster." Dumbledore would not let him go alone. With a staunch ally at his side, Scott didn't protest. Fawkes was sent to hide, and the old man and the boy walked into Kirkwall, the main town on the island. Kirkwall was small, nearly 10,000 people, but it was the largest settlement and fishing port of the Orkney Islands. In 1486, King James III had elevated Kirkwall to a royal burgh. Signs still read City and Royal Burgh of Kirkwall. Scott and Dumbledore strolled through the streets. Dumbledore leaned in to examine everything, curious and delighted, and their presence drew attention. Scott felt as if they were sightseeing and the town was sightseeing them, entirely because of Dumbledore. Scott had dressed like a muggle, with a backpack and ordinary clothes, so he melted into the crowd. Dumbledore had not. He wore long, magnificent robes, pointed leather boots, and a high hat. His silver hair and beard flowed down his back and waist. In the Muggle world, he looked like a wizard straight out of a storybook. Children ran up, unabashed. "Excuse me, sir, are you a magician?" one asked. "Yes, I am a wizard," Dumbledore answered with a smile. They bombarded him with questions. "Can you do magic? Can you make candy appear? Can you perform for us?" Dumbledore obligingly produced a handful of colorful sweets and handed them out. The children cheered, the adults applauded. Under the bright expectations of the crowd, he casually performed a few small tricks, conjuring flowers and tiny birds, and people clapped as if at a street show. "Thank you, but this isn't a performance," he said finally, politely declining any tips. "We're just here to sightsee." A helpful resident immediately volunteered directions, proudly describing the town's historic buildings: St. Magnus Cathedral, the ruins of the Bishop's Palace, and the Earl's Palace. When Scott asked about the library, they said Kirkwall had the world's northernmost Carnegie Library. The original building dated to 1909, but the library had moved to a larger building on Junction Road. They followed the directions and found the Carnegie Library. Scott spent the afternoon with Dumbledore, researching the Stennis standing stones. He learned that Stane comes from the Orcadian dialect, and that in Old Norse it meant stone headland. To the northwest, 1.2 kilometers away, lay the broad cairn stone circle. 1.2 kilometers to the east was Maeshowe. Several Neolithic sites clustered nearby. The Stennis stones were slabs about 30 centimeters thick. 4 of them stood 5 meters tall. Originally, there had been 12 forming a circle roughly 32 meters across, surrounded by a ditch 44 meters in diameter. The circle's entrance faced the Barnhouse settlement beside Loch Harray. A solitary stone of about 5.6 meters to the northwest seemed to point toward the broad cairn circle. Archaeologists had found charcoal, pottery, and animal bones in the ditch. The pottery linked the site to Skara Brae and Maeshowe. Scott also read the more recent history. In the 18th century, people still held religious rites at Stennis, believing they could communicate with Norse gods there. In 1814, a Muggle archaeologist documented those ceremonies and the stones. The most famous pillar had been the Odin stone, a monolith with a hole through its center. Local couples used to clasp hands and pass through it to pledge their fidelity. People had believed the stone held power, but the Odin stone was gone. In 1814, a farmer named W. Mackay had obtained land near the circle. Outraged by the local ceremonies, he smashed the Odin stone and toppled another pillar. The locals were furious. Mackay was forced to stop. The fallen pillar was re-erected in 1906, but the Odin stone could not be restored. Scott turned to Dumbledore. If there really is a 7-person restriction, then maybe the destruction of the Odin stone prevents the entrance from appearing. Dumbledore said nothing, lost in the printed accounts. While Scott copied passages about Stennis, Dumbledore wandered the stacks, picking up odd volumes and nodding with interest. They had been in the library all afternoon. As they prepared to leave, the elderly librarian addressed Scott. "Very interested in the Stennis standing stones, young man?" Scott started and nodded. "Yes, we're planning to visit there tomorrow and came to consult some materials." The librarian smiled. "Well, you're late today. If you're going tomorrow, especially in the morning, you should choose another time." "Tomorrow morning?" Scott asked. "Will something unusual happen there?" "Oh, unusual, yes." The librarian lowered his voice. "Tomorrow's June 21st, the longest day of the year. In former times, the islanders held rites at the stones on this day to reach the gods. These days, nobody believes in the Asgardian gods anymore," he added with a rueful shrug. "Still, every year on that day, the sunrise cannot be seen from inside the circle." "Cannot see the sunrise?" Scott frowned. "Yes." The librarian spoke in a low, mysterious tone. "Tomorrow morning, that place will be shrouded in thick fog, and people will lose their way once they enter the circle." Scott couldn't hide his skepticism. It's only a 32-meter circle. Even with fog, how could people get lost? The librarian's eyes hardened. "It's a curse." His voice dropped further, almost a whisper. "Anyone who approaches that place on that day is sure to meet misfortune." At that moment, a young man hurried over. "Dad," he called, joining them. He pinned an ID badge to his chest and bowed apologetically to Scott and Dumbledore. "I'm sorry. Please don't mind what my father says." He glanced at the librarian and explained. "My brother went there when he was a child, just playing. He couldn't see the path in the fog and had an accident. My father's never been the same. He believes the place is cursed, but you don't have to take it seriously." The old man, the librarian, interrupted vehemently. "Kevin, I told you, the curse exists." "Dad," Kevin snapped, quickly corralling him. "Please, this is a library. Don't shout and don't scare tourists." 496. The rising and setting of the sun and the moon on the Cape. Rumors fluttered like gulls along the docks. The mist that appeared on certain days, the curse the headmaster had mentioned, Kevin's brother who had died so suddenly. Scott wanted to ask for more details, partly out of caution and partly out of curiosity. But Kevin, the librarian, clearly didn't want to pursue the subject and cut his father off. Unable to force the issue, Scott left the library with Dumbledore. They walked to a small park and sat on a bench, gazing at the red spire of St. Magnus Cathedral not far away. "Professor," Scott asked, "what do you make of what the headmaster said?" "Perhaps we should ask the locals," Dumbledore replied. He rose and began talking to an elderly woman resting on another bench. His polite, easy manner quickly won her over. Before long, two more old women wandered into the park and joined the conversation as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Dumbledore charmed them with gentle questions, and laughter rang out. After about half an hour, the three ladies reluctantly took their leave. Dumbledore returned to Scott's side. "The townspeople are skeptical of that gentleman's story," he said. "They don't really believe there is a curse at Stennis Standing Stones, but out of caution, they avoid going near it on June 21st. "Thank you, Professor." Scott felt relieved. "That could work to my advantage. At least I won't have to worry about anyone interrupting whatever I plan to do." As dusk fell, they had dinner in town and found an inn. Scott went to bed early and woke again at 3 a.m. on June 21st. After a quick wash, he opened his door to find Dumbledore already in the corridor. "Do you need a lift?" the headmaster asked, smiling. "Oh, thank you. Yes, Professor. I could apparate, but I don't want the ministry sending me a reprimand." Dumbledore offered his wrist. Scott took it, and they apparated to the headland by the Stennis Standing Stones. A cold sea breeze and the steady sound of waves greeted them. The moon hung over the water, casting shimmering silver across the deep sea. Standing stones of various shapes rose silently from the ground like watchful sentinels. "It's a fine view tonight," Dumbledore said, hands clasped behind his back. Scott watched the old man and felt a pang of sympathy. He sat down on the grass. "You really don't have to look after me like this," he said. "Oh, don't say that, Scott." Dumbledore shook his head. "I would do this for any student who found themselves in such a situation." "You're a good headmaster," Scott said sincerely. Dumbledore smiled, but shook his head. "I often feel I've failed in my duties. I haven't been able to give the role everything it deserves." "Minerva has helped a great deal," Scott offered. "She cares for the school and the students as much as anyone." They watched the sea, moonlight turning the waves to ribboned silver. "You're not only the headmaster," Scott continued. "You are widely regarded as the greatest wizard of this century." Dumbledore laughed, not with pride but with an amused humility. "Do you agree with that praise, Scott? I want to hear what you think. I imagine you've heard and seen a lot about me." Scott smiled, paused, then said, "You've done so much for the magical world, often going beyond what anyone could have asked of you." "But I don't feel I've done well enough," Dumbledore said. "If I were as great as people say, many regrettable things might have been avoided." Scott could see the weariness beneath the humorous facade. He remembered Dumbledore's words about death being like finally going to bed after a long day. "This is what I think," Scott said. "People put expectations on you, and you accepted them. Even if you're not perfect, that courage is enough to call you great." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled behind his half-moon spectacles. "Thank you, Scott." He sat down in the grass beside him. "Tell me, if it were you, what would you choose?" Scott shook his head. "I can't be a savior or a leader. I'm selfish in comparison. I look after myself more than I try to change the world." Dumbledore did not appear disappointed. "Ah, Scott, until the moment of choice, you never know what you will do." "Perhaps," Scott conceded, still sure he could never be Dumbledore. The headmaster pressed on. "Remember when you heard that men of Lord Voldemort were attacking Hogwarts? You returned immediately without hesitation and took part in the battle." Scott remembered the message from Professor Flitwick and how instinctively he had gone back. "I worried about my friends," he said. "If it hadn't been Hogwarts, I probably wouldn't have acted." "That was enough," Dumbledore said, repeating himself. Scott squinted at him. Moonlight silvered Dumbledore's beard. His sapphire eyes glowed under the spectacles. "You are not me, Scott, and I do not expect my students to become another me. Be yourself." He rose. A soft, melodious cry announced Fawkes as the phoenix appeared and landed on Dumbledore's shoulder. "You're right about one thing," Dumbledore said, stroking the bird's wings. "This is your adventure." Scott stood. "Then I won't jump into your affairs recklessly. I'll watch from the side." Dumbledore added, "But remember, the moment I judge that you are in danger, I will remove you from here at once." He and Fawkes slowly faded in the moonlight until they were gone. "Thank you, Professor," Scott called after them, then sat down. He took out his notebook and, consulting his transcriptions, located where the destroyed Odin stone had once stood. He walked to that spot and examined it carefully. There was nothing, just flat grass and the surrounding standing stones. Kevin had said his brother had an accident here, but how could that happen on an open, grassy headland among stones? Even with dense fog, the chance of a fatal accident seemed vanishingly small. Could he somehow have struck one of the stones and died? Scott shook his head and moved around the stones, attaching the small magical eyes he had prepared to each one. Finally, he stood at the cliff edge and watched the sea. At dawn, a flock of black crows descended, and Lambo landed on his shoulder. "Long time no see," Lambo said as it hopped and settled. "Long time," Scott said with a smile. "You've been busy, haven't you?" Lambo looked back at the stones and cocked its head. It doesn't look very magical." "Maybe it's not time yet," Scott said. The birds of the headland scattered as Lambo chirped. The crows rose and circled, then landed across the stones and within the circle. "Now we wait for sunrise," Scott said. He sat cross-legged and watched the moon sink toward the sea. As the moon set, the eastern horizon began to change. Blue turned to purple, then a thread of red appeared. Silence fell, profound and absolute. The sound of waves and wind died away until there was nothing to hear. Scott looked at Lambo, but though it opened its beak, there was no sound. In his mind, a phrase surfaced. The silent land, tower extending to the earth's core. A white mist had risen, seeping across the grass like a slow tide. It rolled in and steadily filled the circle, climbing around the bases of the stones until half of some of them were submerged. The mist pooled inside the ditch that encircled the stones. Inside and outside that ditch, the world felt different. Ahead, the eastern sky brightened. The sun was about to break the horizon. Scott tried to speak but could hear no voice. Vibrations in his throat and chest produced nothing audible. Lambo nudged his shoulder with a wing and led his gaze to the stones. Inside the circle, a thick, cloud-like white spread as far as he could see. Only the tops of the tallest megaliths rose above it. He checked the feeds from the eyes he'd installed with his magic mirror, but the fog was too dense to see through. He stepped to the edge of the ditch and pushed his magical senses outward, but they vanished into the mist as if swallowed. His usual awareness, the sense that never failed him, was gone. He felt unnerved, like a man suddenly deprived of sight. Lambo fluffed and comforted him again. The sun's rim breached the horizon, and a golden path cut across the sea. Dawn light washed the mist within the circle, tinting it with warm color like watercolor. Scott's problem, however, remained. The rune he'd been translating had whispered, "Island of the far north isles, longest day of daylight, place pointed to by the standing stone's shadow." With the stones plunging into the dense mist, where could their shadows fall? 497. Sudden changes. The morning sun climbed over the horizon. Scott stood outside the Stennis standing stones, beyond the circular ditch, frowning at the dense, motionless fog pooled inside. The mist wrapped every standing stone. He could neither see them nor sense them. His earlier preparations seemed useless. The eyes he'd placed on the stones were obscured, and the crows were silent and unseen. He glanced at Lambo on his shoulder. With sound unable to travel, the Black Wing Lord could not give orders to the raven flock. Scott still had options. He took off his backpack, drew his wand and a severed arm bone from it, and set the pack at his feet. From the tip of his wand, a few crows burst forth, startled, beating their wings and flying before Lambo, beaks open. Neither Scott nor Lambo could hear them. Legilimency, he thought, and chanted the spell silently while waving his wand. The crow's message slipped into his head. When submerged by the white mist, they lost their strength and could not escape unless summoned by contract. The information deepened Scott's concern. The fog had never spread beyond the ditch, but he retreated a few steps anyway. Then, for a strange moment, the mist in front of him shifted. He stopped and moved to the precise angle where the flicker had shown itself. Sunlight, mist, refraction. He saw a scene he hadn't seen in years. The long-lost Odin stone, a boulder larger than the other standing stones, hollowed out beneath, exactly as in the old records. A purple shadow extended from the hollow and rotated slowly like a clock's second hand until it stopped. Scott crouched and murmured, "So, what did you say?" Lambo replied. "Oh, I can hear you again." Sound came back. Sea wind, waves on the rocks, the cries of crows, and for a moment Scott felt as if he were listening to a vivid, beautiful piece of music. The feeling might be fleeting, so he snapped back to business, drew a small wooden box from his pack, and opened it. "Lead the way, then. Golzan." He plunged his arm into the box and brought out the creature, then cast an engorgement charm. With a flash of light, Golzan swelled into a true Komodo dragon. "Go, Golzan. Scout the spot the shadow pointed to." Golzan nodded and darted forward on all fours, crossed the ditch, and disappeared into the fog. Scott felt the bond to Golzan thin as it moved into the mist, but thankfully, his preemptive work kept the connection intact. From the subtle tug, he could estimate its location. It had reached the place the standing stone's shadow had indicated. Under Scott's remote guidance, Golzan paced, burrowed, and searched, but came up empty. A wind-splitting sound announced a sea eagle descending. It landed and transformed into a red-haired girl. "Savannah?" Scott rose, surprised. "Good morning, Scott." Savannah beamed and ran up to him. "I knew you'd come today." "You snuck out?" he said, looking at her. "Behind your grandfather's back?" She only smiled and held out a small notebook bound with glued leaves like a prize. "Are you going to send me away, Scott? I got some valuable clues." She glanced at the sun, now fully risen, and her smile tightened. "Hurry, time's running out. If I remember right, the entrance to that tower only appears on the longest day of the year, within an hour after sunrise." She thrust the notebook at him. "I copied the ancient notes my family kept." "Thank you." Scott took the notebook, skimmed it, and closed it before returning it to her. "Some things can't be solved by Transfiguration. You have to go there yourself to open that entrance." "But the fog is dangerous," Savannah warned. "It drains people's strength." "Don't worry," Scott said, confident. "First, Golzan, back!" He shrank Golzan down. Then he enlarged Siren, Horace, and Edgar, taking them from their storage, and produced 4 small metal balls, spoils from Waldo Giral. He also enlarged Lambo, cinched a deformation lizard skin bag to his waist, cast a bubblehead charm on himself, and entered Siren's water sphere. The other 3 summoned beasts each carried a small metal ball, and Scott activated a cubic magic barrier around the water sphere, giving them 2 layers of protection. "Depart." Scott, centered in the water sphere pool, waved. Savannah watched with concern. Under the double protection of the water sphere and magic barrier, Scott crossed the ditch and entered the mist. Outside the barrier, everything turned white. Guided by memory and the faint tug of the shadow, he moved toward the spot the shadow had pointed to. Inside the mist, he couldn't see the reappeared Odin stone, but when he reached the location, a black shadow spread across the grass beneath his feet. The ground gave way, and he began to fall. "Fuck!" he shouted. It happened so fast. He'd expected Dumbledore's intervention at a critical moment, but there was no time to dwell on that. Sirene's water sphere could float, so Scott, Lambo, Edgar, and Horace were fine, but Golzan had nothing to stop its fall. To avoid breaking formation, the others were dragged down with it. Scott cast Lumos, but light was already coming from below, molten, rolling magma. He didn't have time to ask how magma could be here. He had to act. He had Sirene move close to the edge of the sphere, reached out, returned Golzan to normal, and used a locomotor charm to bring the Komodo dragon and the metal ball back to his hand. The magic barrier lost a corner and collapsed. Before it failed completely, he retracted his hand back into the water sphere and had Sirene reposition them to the center. Freed from Golzan's weight, the water sphere stopped falling and began moving horizontally to escape the magma's reach. But the magma spread like a sea. They searched for the edge a long time. The historical passage ran through Scott's mind. One died in fierce fire, one died in deep water, one died at the treetop, one died at the tower's bottom, one died from falling rocks, one died from ground collapse. Had the fierce fire meant this magma? He sent Lambo and Edgar, fastest of flight, to scout. They returned shaking their heads. Scott looked up at the endless darkness above and down at the magma seas below. A thought he didn't want to face came to him. A tower descending to the center of the earth. If the tower had levels, perhaps the next layer lay beyond the magma. Crossing a sea of lava would take courage and luck. He hoped Doherty, who had once died here and lost the St. Tree heart, had not perished in the magma. Otherwise, that heart would be ash and dust. After more scouting flights that showed no safer route, Scott prepared to brave the magma. He used wooden blocks to transfigure 4 small fish and built a small cubic barrier in the center of the water sphere with the metal balls. He restored Lambo and Horus to normal size, put Horus and Golzon back in their boxes, and kept Lambo on his shoulder. Water attribute Siren would carry them through the magma. Fire attribute Edgar, untroubled by heat, stayed outside the sphere for contingencies. Then, they began descending. As they neared the magma, the sphere's outer water boiled away. Siren replenished it at top speed to keep the sphere's volume intact. Scott sat cross-legged inside the magic barrier, his right hand constantly touching the silver snake-shaped necklace on his left wrist, his last safeguard. If things went wrong, he could only try to escape. When the water sphere touched the magma, the rolling, seething red quieted. The unbearable heat faded, and something below drew them in. The world blurred. They surfaced in deep, dim water. The water sphere had vanished, or merged seamlessly with its surroundings. Scott kept Siren producing fresh water to wrap them. He didn't want the surrounding water to touch his barrier. Siren enveloped him and Edgar as they pushed forward. Edgar, once a blazing fire raven, wilting now in the depth, managed only a faint glow. It wasn't a real bird, so breathing wasn't an issue. Scott held his wand, Lumos still active, and searched the bottom for the Saint Tree heart. He saw no bones, no relics, no trace of Doherty, nothing that resembled the heart. The deep water, at least, was not as endless as the magma on the first layer. "My instinct says we go up," he said. "Next, we go up." As soon as the water sphere, or rather Siren's protective envelope, broke the surface and rose, they entered a new world, an inverted realm. Beneath them yawned unfathomable, lightless darkness. Above, an upside-down forest of black trees grew densely in a sky that felt like ground. The trunks and branches were astonishingly straight. Numerous forks, but no twists, and not a single leaf among them. They looked metallic and alien. Scott ordered Siren to hold at a distance. "Do not approach the trees rashly." Edgar, unable to tolerate the water any longer, burst from their shelter, body suddenly engulfed in flames and burning like a small sun. Lambo, still perched on Scott's shoulder, fluttered up and looked around. "What do we do next?" At that moment, Scott felt the gravity shift beneath him. He floated up and landed on top of the magic barrier, lying there and peering through the water globe at the black forest that grew upside down above him. "The sudden change in gravity is the most dangerous thing in this space," he said. Lambo had been disoriented too, flapping before it managed to right itself, though it now seemed to be flying belly up. "If someone enters here unprepared," Scott continued, "they'd be flung into that forest above when gravity flips. And those trees, those branches are too dense and they look razor sharp," Lambo finished. It turned to look at Edgar outside the water globe. "Even though it's wrapped in flame, it must have flipped over too. This is weird." Scott shook his head. "I can't undo the barrier to let you and Horus out. Only Edgar can help search from the outside." "You can summon crows," Lambo suggested. "Can you call them here?" Scott nodded and focused. Summoning something farther from the wand required greater concentration and more magic. He waved his wand, and a flock of black crows suddenly appeared from somewhere beyond the water globe, cawing in confusion as the inverted gravity disoriented them. Lambo called to them a few times. They settled down. Under Scott and Lambo's direction, Edgar and the crows dispersed to search. Before Edgar accelerated, he snuffed out the flames cloaking him. "Lumos," Scott muttered and lit his wand. In the pitch-black water globe, he and Lambo waited for the results. Besides finding the Saint Tree heart or the entrance to the next layer, Scott wanted to test whether the curse really existed. Until now, only Transfiguration products had touched the outside. Sending the crows out was also a test. His magic mirror vibrated. "Dumbledore," he said quietly and tapped the surface. The mirror showed Dumbledore and Savannah. "Great, finally connected." Savannah's voice came bright through the glass. "Professor Miss Doherty," Scott waved, "was my mirror unable to connect earlier?" "Yes," Savannah said. "Professor Dumbledore tried many times." Dumbledore added, "Scott, are you all right?" "So far, yes. I've had some trials, but I haven't met any real danger yet." "That's good," Dumbledore exhaled in relief. "I'm sorry. The mists blocked my magic, and I couldn't reach you in time. Fawkes couldn't find you either." On Dumbledore's mirror, Dumbledore held up his magic phone. and showed Scott the Stennis standing stones clearly visible. As soon as someone enters, the entrance closes, he said. I think all 7 wizards mentioned in the old stories must have entered at once. I should have come with you. Scott waved him off. Professor, this is my adventure. He then recounted everything that had happened since he'd entered. After listening, Dumbledore sounded relieved. You handled it well and were cautious, Scott. If someone else had gone in, there might already have been casualties. Savannah leaned into the camera, excited. Scott, do you still have the gift I gave you? The golden acorns? Scott reached into his deformable lizard skin bag and produced 2 golden oak acorns. I have them. Good. Savannah smiled. The Saint Tree heart is a piece of wood that looks like a golden gem. When you approach it with Saint Tree fruit, their powers will resonate. If you're attuned, you'll perceive the Saint Tree fruit's magical fluctuations, and the heart will glow a golden light to guide you. Keep the fruits close? Dumbledore prompted. Yes, keep them near you. The fruits hold the Saint Tree's power and can resist the curse to a degree. Savannah's tone turned serious. And don't stay inside the tower too long. 8 hours from now should be the limit. If you don't come out before then, the curse can't be removed. So the wizard who escaped here but still died must have stayed too long? Scott asked. Probably, Savannah said. And perhaps he never had a druid priest perform a purification ritual after coming out. Scott was about to bundle the acorns on a cord when he felt something hot in the bag. He pulled out the little alpaca skull Luna had given him. It was hotter than he'd ever seen it, and red cracks like veins had crawled across the stone around the large lucky bean eyes. The cracks were narrow but vivid. Maybe the curse is real, Scott murmured, and maybe it can affect things the water globe and the barrier can't protect. Let me see, Dumbledore asked. Scott lifted his wand so Dumbledore could inspect the skull. This looks like the work of a Peruvian wizard, Dumbledore said at once. This skull can't fully withstand the curse, Scott concluded. But with the skull and the Saint Tree fruits, the curse can be partially offset, Savannah added. When you come out, I'll help purify you. A proper ritual will remove it. Still, don't stay in there too long, Dumbledore warned. At that moment, Edgar returned, reigniting the flames that bathed the area in fierce light. The crows cawed and circled. Lambo chirped translations. They didn't find any golden wood, it said. They say the entrance to the next layer is in the center of the black forest above, where the trees are densest and a mist covers it. Then we go there first, Scott decided. Edgar, lead. Siren, follow. Caw! Edgar cried and flew forward, Siren steering the water globe after it. Strange, none of the crows have returned, Lambo fretted. Did something happen to them? Edgar called out again. Lambo answered for it. The trees attacked the crows, but they didn't touch Edgar. Be careful, Scott. Savannah's worried voice filtered through the mirror. Scott, it's too dangerous. Be very careful. And then her words blurred until the connection cut. Scott checked the mirror. Communication cut off, he said, and slid it away. A new wave of crows flew close to the water globe, cawing. Lambo translated. Their companions had been impaled by branches, and they hadn't found anything notable. One thing's odd, Scott said, frowning. 7 wizards entered long ago. 6 died inside the tower, 1 by fierce fire, 1 by deep water, 1 by tree thorns. But we didn't see any bodies in the deep water or lodged in the trees. Bodies decay, Lambo pointed out. It's been 1,000 years. They could be gone. Maybe. Scott stared up at that inverted black canopy. Edgar called again. Caw, caw, caw. It signaled they had reached the center. The trees here were thicker, their straight, razor-like branches interwoven into a black, bristling mass. A faint mist curled among them. Get closer, but be careful, Scott told Siren. The fish-like creature wagged its tail and piloted the water globe forward. Edgar came in just ahead, approaching the trees. Strange, when Edgar drew near, the branches did nothing. But as the water globe approached, those same straight branches shot out like spears toward the globe, piercing the water shell until they hit the magic barrier. The spikes hung there, blocking and jamming the globe. Scott acted fast. He transformed the 4 small metal-bearing fish that had been holding the spheres into crows and ordered Siren to disperse the water globe. The globe collapsed, and Scott mounted his flying broom, taking the 4 newly made crows with him. As soon as he left, the branches withdrew from Siren, and it sank a short distance on a current of water. "Burn them, Edgar," Scott commanded. Edgar exhaled a scorching column of flame. Wherever the fire struck, the black branches retracted instantly, leaving bare trunks scorched but not consumed. The flames licked the bark and left marks, but couldn't set the trees ablaze. With the branches pulled back, Scott could see a bare stone door standing at the center of the forest. "Stop," he ordered, and Edgar cut the fire. Within seconds, the branches snapped back into place and hid the door again. "Siren, try the water blade," Scott said. The fish swam to the surface, thrust its long jaw out, and spat a thin white blade of water. The blade struck the black branches with a grinding rasp that made Scott flinch. It sliced through a few limbs and nicked trunks, but sounded dull and rusty, like a blade long neglected. The water blade seemed to lose its edge. The cut branches slowly grew back to their original form. "Only fireworks here," Lambo said. "Have Edgar keep burning the branches, and we'll slip through while they're retracted." "That's our only option," Scott agreed. "Edgar, clear a path again." Flames lanced into the canopy, and the branches folded into the trunks. Scott sent the crows ahead to scout. Despite their earlier close calls, they obeyed and flew through the opening Edgar made, passing where the branches had retracted. Seeing that the way was open, Scott mounted his broom and rose toward the forest, following the scorched trail toward the stone door. 499. Adventure must always persist to the end. Scott sent one of the crows carrying the small metal ball toward him, drew the magic barrier in around himself, and stepped through the black forest. With Edgar's streams of fire cutting a path, he and Siren passed the worst of the woods and arrived before a massive stone door. Still mounted on his flying broom, Scott circled the door and inspected it closely. It was bare, no glyphs, no seams, no inscriptions. "Try pushing it open, Siren," he ordered, then moved aside. Siren guided the water orb in close, accelerated, and struck the door with its long jaw. Bang, the stone didn't budge. Scott frowned and told Serene to stand down. He coasted his broom close, reached through the magic barrier, and placed a hand on the cold stone. "Nothing." He sighed. "I think I'll have to take down the barrier." "It's too dangerous," Lambo warned. "You could trigger a worse curse." Scott smiled and dug through his pack. He tied 2 golden acorns together and hung them around his neck. He wrapped the alpaca skull with a separate cord and fastened it to his belt. "Savannah said acorns and skulls can resist some curses," he muttered. "I've come this far. If I'm inside the tower, I want to find the Saint Tree Heart myself." Then he did exactly that. He removed the barrier. 4 crows fluttered down and placed the small metal ball in his palm. He dropped the ball into his enchanted lizard skin bag and laid his hand on the door. "I realize now how presumptuous my plan was," he said. "Even if I'd tried to run this from outside the tower, remote controlling Serene and the others wouldn't have cleared this level." Without another word, the stone door answered, at first an ominous creak, then grinding, then a thunderous groan as the slab sank slowly into the earth. A huge stone frame remained, and beyond it the air shimmered with transparent, swirling ripples. "Incendio!" Scott shouted. He conjured a roaring wall of fire around the doorway, molding it with his wand. "Your work is done, Edgar. Come, this way." Edgar ceased spouting flame and flew down to him. Scott flicked his wand and shrank both Edgar and Siren to pocket size. He pulled out the small wooden box from the lizard skin bag and returned the 2 creatures to their compartments. "What are you doing, Scott?" Lambo asked, curious. "Don't you want us to help?" "Let's see what's on the other side first," Scott said. He didn't close the box. "You can go into Horace's compartment, too." "Fine. Call if you need us," Lambo said, obedient, and burrowed into the box. Scott stowed the box and his broom, gripped his wand, and stepped into the frame. On the other side was a barren, rocky wasteland under a startlingly realistic starry sky. The stars themselves were the light source. Suddenly a streak flashed across that artificial sky, one meteor, then another, bigger, brighter, doomed to strike exactly where he stood. He transformed into his animagus form, a peregrine falcon, and shot forward. The great rock slammed down behind him in a thunderous crash, spraying debris. He weaved through chunks, bouncing and skittering across the ground. When it was quiet, he slowed and glanced up. The sky had opened into a meteor shower. Rocks hissed and shrank into his vision. plummeting in endless torrents. Scott didn't try to block them with Protego. Stones that size carried too much momentum for a simple shield. He kept to the air, sprinting and dodging, feathers and wings straining. The barrage finally stopped. He reverted to human form and collapsed on the ground, breathless. He checked his mechanical wristwatch, drank a stamina potion, and pulled the little wooden box back out. He took Golzan, the summoned beast, out and used an expansion charm. If Doherty from 1,000 years ago died in this storm, the Saint Tree heart must be buried, Scott said. Find it, Golzan. Hurry. Golzan dove into the dirt at once. Lambo popped his head out of Horace's compartment. You okay? He asked. Scott watched the fake sky warily. I just hope the Saint Tree heart didn't get smashed. It probably didn't, Lambo offered. If it were that fragile, it wouldn't be a druid's treasure. Scott smiled at the illogic and accepted the comfort. Lambo suggested, why not dig an underground shelter, like you and Dumbledore did at the Quidditch World Cup? Scott shook his head. The fallen rocks were monstrous. To be safe, he'd need to burrow 100 meters down, and that kind of transfiguration would sap too much magic. Luckily, my animagus form is a falcon, he said. Dodging is better than trying to stop them. He closed the box and tucked it away. The meteors began again about 10 minutes later. Scott became a falcon, zipped higher, and threaded through the crashing stones. The next shower seemed longer, 15 minutes, leaving him more exhausted. Each rest period between storms shortened. The pattern worried him. He couldn't waste time. If he didn't get through during a rest period, a portkey would be his only escape from the tower's descent to the Earth's core. When the next lull came, Scott didn't waste it. He shot straight up to a cluster of stationary floating boulders and pushed through them into a pale light. His vision swam, and he stepped into the next chamber, the 5th level. On the surface, everything looked the same. Starry sky, rocky ground. But he kept his broom ready and descended cautiously. As he neared the ground, the earth vanished beneath him. 100-meter-wide chasm yawned open in an instant, an enormous suction pulling downward. He was over it in seconds, broom steady against the pull. The pit vanished as quickly as it came. Now it's your turn, he muttered and sent Golzan down. The beast merged into the soil the moment it landed, head disappearing beneath the surface. Scott hovered, heart pounding. If the threat here was ground collapse rather than meteors, then at least he could breathe. Lambo poked his head out again. How'd it go? Golzan lifted its head, a piece of polished golden wood clenched in its jaws. The acorn on Scott's chest began to glow faintly. It found something, Lambo chirped. Scott let out a laugh that was mostly relief. He removed his protective barrier and descended a little, then used a shrinking charm on Golzan from a distance and a moving charm to bring the beast and the golden wood to his side. The wood was about as thick as a wrist, smooth, warm, humming with a faint life. This is the Saint Tree heart, Scott said, fingers closing around the wooden piece. The golden acorn on his chest shone brighter in response. So we can leave? Lambo asked, joyful. No, Scott surprised them both. I've already reached the 5th level. Whether the tower goes 6 or 7 levels, I want to see it through to the end. You should leave, Lambo warned. Don't forget the curse. You've still got time. Scott glanced at his watch. I can't help wondering what those 7 wizards were looking for 1,000 years ago. Lambo, popping his head fully out, grinned. Didn't you say adventures only pay off if you stick them out to the end? 500, Super Magic Advancement Ceremony. Oh, Lambo looked Scott over and sighed. You've really let yourself go. Scott shrugged. I'd feel weird about quitting now. He scanned the surroundings again. A tower like this in this form must have been built by ancient wizards. He pointed upward. The Stennis standing stones were built in the Neolithic around 3000 BC. All right, you don't have to lecture me, Lambo said in a resigned tone. It fluttered out of the small wooden box and landed on Scott's shoulder. What you need to do now is find the entrance to the next level. Is it in the sky above or in the earth below? Golzan didn't find anything underground, Scott said, putting the small wooden box away. He examined the golden, wrist-thick heart of the sacred tree he'd taken. I can sense how pure this magic is. He found another cord, wrapped it tight around the tree heart, and hung it around his neck. Looking at the oak heart and acorn dangling against his chest, he added, If it's this, it should help resist curses. He grimaced a little at how it looked, then gripped his flying broom with both hands and ascended. Unlike the previous level, the starry sky here felt much farther away, truly distant. Scott rode the broom for half an hour and still couldn't approach it. "Oh, did you gauge something wrong?" Lambo asked, flying beside him. Scott paused and thought for a moment. Maybe it's about speed. He stowed the broom, shifted into a peregrine falcon, and shot upward at full speed. His Patronus, identical to his animagus form, kept close. "Wait, if speed matters, I'm the fastest." Lambo took off after him and caught up quickly. Scott had guessed right. About 5 minutes later, they broke into the starry sky. Unlike the rubble-strewn level below, this sky was filled with floating clusters of light. He remounted the broom and reached out, but the lights had no substance, mere illusory clusters. In his magic perception, they registered as pure mana, without any defining qualities. If all of this could be collected, the total magic would exceed even Hogwarts Castle's reserves. Scott was a little envious. With a reserve like that, he could do so much. "Can you collect them?" Lambo asked. "I've never studied the problem. Maybe I can get outside help." "Dumbledore?" Lambo tilted its head. "Your link is cut off." "No." Scott drew a blank small picture frame from his shape-shifting lizard skin bag. "Ravenclaw mentor." "Here?" Lambo frowned. "We're probably in a different space. Can she still be summoned? You can always trust a Ravenclaw." Scott tapped the blank canvas with his wand. "Respected Ravenclaw mentor, your apprentice requires assistance." The blank canvas gained color and resolved into the dignified, beautiful figure of the Ravenclaw mentor seated in an eagle-winged, high-backed chair. "Good afternoon, my apprentice." She smiled and took in the scene around Scott. "It appears you've entered that tower." "Yes, mentor." Scott quickly recounted how he'd fallen into the tower, passed the first levels, and now stood beneath a sky full of pure floating magic. "Is there any way to take it with me?" Ravenclaw examined the glowing clusters in the frame and nodded. No wonder, such a reservoir would tempt anyone. She thought for a moment and then smiled. "Congratulations, my apprentice. Your gains from this venture may be unparalleled." "You mean," Scott's heart leapt, "she had a method. Are you certain these are pure magic without impurities?" she asked. "Yes, mentor. My perception confirms it." "Good. Your perception is reliable." Ravenclaw brightened. "Do you remember what I told you about bloody plunder?" "I remember." Scott recalled the brutal ritual. Effective but cruel, needing rare ingredients and deforming the caster. He'd rejected it for those reasons. "What I never mentioned is that when a large amount of pure magic is available, we don't need the gruesome ingredients." Ravenclaw's eyes gleamed. The ritual becomes not bloody plunder, but super magic advancement. Super magic advancement? Scott's pulse quickened. "In the old records of my family's collection, this ritual appears only once." She explained softly. "Ancient wizards completed it. There's even a legend that bloody plunder is a degraded substitute for super magic advancement." "So bloody plunder arose because the real thing needed conditions too harsh to meet?" Scott asked. "Exactly." Ravenclaw nodded. "Large sources of magic aren't that rare. Hogwarts is one, but pure, undifferentiated magic is. Magic gathered over time from many wizards mixes properties. It's useful for powering large-scale enchantments, but you can't absorb it into yourself." Scott stared at the floating clusters. "But the magic here you can absorb." "Precisely." Ravenclaw looked at him with quiet encouragement. "This could be the key to stopping Salazar." Scott grinned despite himself. "Mentor, you're right. I've hit the jackpot. Tell me what to do." Ravenclaw's composure slipped as she grew visibly excited. "First, collect the magic and form a legendary magic crystal." "Magic crystal?" Scott felt the fantastic grow stranger. "A magic crystal forms when a vast amount of pure magic is gathered and compressed," she continued. "To make one, you must master a very difficult rune circuit, a circuit composed of the original runes." A surprisingly simple rune pattern appeared on the canvas. It consisted of 14 marks, but they were all repetitions of just 2 original runes. Despite the apparent simplicity, Ravenclaw warned Scott it would be hard to master. He set the picture frame where Lambo could hold it, drew out his notebook and steel pen, and copied the circuit carefully. When he finished, Ravenclaw reappeared. "You've recorded it. Begin practicing," she said. Scott set a sheet of parchment under his notebook, conjured an ink bottle and quill, and bled a small cut into the ink. Practicing runes with blood-tinted ink had proven the most effective method for him. He drew and redrew the circuit while Ravenclaw critiqued him from the frame. "That stroke is wrong. Start again. The connection must be continuous. Balance your pressure. Fluidity. Remember they form a whole." He failed again and again. The pattern looked simple, but behaved unlike any rune circuit he'd used. Hours passed. Scott burned through sheet after sheet. Ravenclaw's steady admonitions helped. "Calm your mind. Understand the structure." Gradually, the lines changed. "Not bad, you've improved. This one could work. Try activating it." Scott fed magic into the parchment. The ink glowed faint blue, and when he brought it near a floating mote of magic, delicate filaments split off and were absorbed by the drawn circuit. The parchment glowed brighter until it cracked. Ravenclaw cheered. "It works. Now draw the circuit with your magic, no medium, in one continuous motion." Scott raised his wand and tried. Thin golden traces formed rune shapes in the air and collapsed awkwardly. He tried again and failed. Drawing runes in the air was a technique he'd used before. His dark illusion used invisible ground-drawn runes, but this original rune circuit required a different kind of clarity. His prior tricks were useless here. He rested, closed his eyes, and recalled Dumbledore's maxim: "Magic is the power of belief." Clearing his thoughts, he focused on one immovable conviction: he must succeed. He stopped calculating fallback plans and poured every ounce of magic into a single cast. "Come out," he roared. The tip of his wand exploded with golden light like a miniature sun, flooding the cold, starry void. Massive runes formed in the air, giant symbols connecting and locking into place until a vast rune circuit filled nearly the whole sky. "Success!" Ravenclaw cried. Exhaustion hit him as his reserves bled away, but Scott laughed triumphantly. The giant circuit shifted from gold to pure blue and began to rotate. Slowly, the floating magic clusters across the void drifted inward, drawn to the spinning pattern. One by one, they gathered toward the center. As the clusters compressed, they brightened into an intense white, collecting, compressing, converging. "Mentor, what do I do once the crystal forms?" Scott asked, pacing on his broomline. "You should be somewhere safe," Ravenclaw warned. "This place might not be secure." "No, this place will do." Scott produced the barrier ball and siren, demonstrating the double protection of a magic barrier and the water sphere. Ravenclaw smiled. She approved of his caution. "Next you must prepare your body," she said, and faded again. Two human body diagrams appeared on the canvas, front and back, covered in complicated patterns. Scott copied them onto parchment. Lambeau peered and asked, "How are you going to draw those on yourself?" "You forget I can transfigure paint into a seamless drawing," Scott said. He had used that method before, painting with transfigured pigments, so he could reproduce the pattern exactly. Ravenclaw's portrait reappeared. "You will use your blood," she said. "You'll need quite a bit. I hope you brought a potion to produce blood." "I did. I make as complete preparations as I can," Scott replied. "Good. Once the crystal forms, you must use blood to draw the ritual patterns on both your body and the crystal, then perform the ritual step by step." Scott turned his gaze to the giant rune circuit. The stars of the sky were disappearing into its center. He watched until all the clusters had vanished. The rune circuit accelerated. The compressed white orb shrank and dimmed until, with a final flash, it collapsed and the circuit winked out. Scott flew to the spot where the center had been. Lambeau held the picture frame and followed. A colorless, faintly luminous crystal floated there, transparent, about the size of a human head, unremarkable in shape but humming with power. "This is the magic crystal." Scott cupped it in his hands. It was astonishingly light, lighter than a comparably sized stone, almost plastic-like, yet his magic perception made its terrible potency unmistakable. He was grinning like a fool. He re-established the barrier ball and siren. Sitting cross-legged inside the barrier, he produced his blood-generating potion and conjured a glass vial for the blood. He drank the potion and, as it took effect, slit his finger and collected fresh blood in the vial. "Enough," he muttered, stopping the bleeding with dittany. Even so, his earlier magical exertion and the blood loss left him woozy. He drank another stamina potion, waited until he felt steady, and then began the ritual work. First, he painted the pattern onto the crystal. He raised his wand, coaxed a stream of blood from the vial, and the crimson flowed into the air, tracing the intricate design before imprinting solidly onto the crystal. The blood didn't drip, it held fast, as if glued by enchantment. He stripped off his clothes, then used the same method to imprint the pattern across his own skin, following Ravenclaw's diagrams exactly. When the markings were complete, he set his wand aside, sat cross-legged, and cradled the crystal in his arms. He closed his eyes, cleared his mind, and began a long, convoluted incantation, each syllable precise, each cadence exact, ready to start the super magic advancement.